Hey there, and welcome back. If you are already settled, the lamp turned low, the day finally loosening its grip on you, then you are exactly where you need to be, because tonight asks nothing of you but stillness. Tonight we are going to sit, for a few quiet hours, with a woman whose name almost no one remembers, though you have certainly heard the names of her children. She was the mother of the most famous sisters in English history. One of the girls became a king's mistress, and the other became a queen whose downfall broke a kingdom away from the Church of Rome and changed the course of the world. And yet the woman who bore them, who raised them, who watched them climb to the very summit of the realm and then watched the realm destroy them, has been allowed to fade almost entirely from memory, a shadow standing just behind the famous faces, unnamed and unconsidered. Her name was Elizabeth Howard, and before this evening is over, you will understand why her forgotten life is one of the most quietly devastating stories the Tudor age has to offer. For she gave the world Anne Boleyn, and she lived to bury her. Before we go back to her, I want to say that if you find something restful in these slow walks into the past, you are very welcome to follow along, so that the next of these quiet evenings can find its way to you when you need it. I would love to know too, where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are, whether there is rain at the glass, or a still and frosty dark outside, and you are always welcome to leave a word below, for I look through them, every one, and I never cease to wonder at how a life 5 centuries gone can gather people from every corner of the earth into the same hushed and quiet room at the close of the day. None of that is asked of you, though. All that is asked of you tonight is that you let the present loosen its hold and come back with me into a world of cold stone and tallow light, of green Kentish hills and the dangerous glitter of a royal court. Picture this. It is the grey hour just before a winter dawn, sometime in the first years of the 1500s, and we are standing in the courtyard of a moated manor house in the soft folds of the Kent countryside. The house is called Hever, and it is not a fortress, not a grim stronghold raised for war, but a comfortable and handsome dwelling of mellow stone within its still and silver moat, the kind of place a prosperous and ambitious family might cherish and improve. The air is cold and smells of wood smoke and wet earth and the byre. A single window high in the gatehouse shows the faint amber wavering of a candle, for someone within is awake before the servants, awake before the light. And if we let ourselves drift up toward that window and look gently in, we will find a young woman sitting with a sleeping infant against her shoulder, her dark Howard eyes fixed on nothing, her mind somewhere far ahead of her in years she cannot see. She does not know what is coming. She has no inkling that the small warm weight against her shoulder will one day wear the crown of England and will one day lay her head upon a scaffold. She is simply a young mother in the cold before dawn, and she is the beginning of our story. Let us begin with the strangeness of her absence, because it is the first thing that strikes anyone who goes looking for Elizabeth Howard. We live in an age intimately familiar with the Boleyns. There is Anne, of course, the dark and dazzling woman who refused to be a mistress and held out for a crown, who charmed and provoked a king into tearing his kingdom away from Rome, and who paid for it at last upon a scaffold within the walls of the Tower of London. There is Mary, the elder sister, the king's mistress before Anne was ever queen, whose quieter story has lately been told and retold. There is George, the brilliant and doomed brother, who went to the block beside his sister in the same dreadful week. We even know the father, Thomas Boleyn, the cold and clever climber who rose on his children's fortunes and survived their ruin. The Boleyns are among the most written about family in all of English history, picked over by scholars and dramatized in 100 tellings. And yet the woman at the very heart of them, the wife and the mother, the one who bore them all and bound them together, stands almost entirely in shadow. So uncertain is the record, indeed, that historians cannot even agree on the most basic facts of her family on the order in which her children were born or the exact years of their births. Whether Mary or Anne was the elder sister is a question debated without final resolution, argued back and forth on slender scraps of evidence, and the birth years of all three surviving children are matters of estimate and inference rather than record. This uncertainty about so fundamental a thing as the ages of her children tells us how thin the documentation of her life truly is, how much we are working in shadow and guesswork even on the plainest questions. If we cannot say with confidence when her children were born, how much less can we say of her thoughts, her feelings, her character, the inner life that no record preserved. The very debates of the scholars, their careful weighing of fragmentary evidence to settle the simplest facts, are a measure of the silence that surrounds her, the vast blank space where a documented life should be. We are reconstructing a woman from the faintest of traces, and we must hold our conclusions lightly, knowing how little firm ground there is beneath us. We know the bare frame of her life, and almost nothing of its inner texture. We know roughly when she was born, and to whom, and when she married, and the names of the children she brought into the world, and roughly when she died. But of the person herself, of what she thought and felt and feared, of how she sounded, and what she loved, the record is very nearly silent. No letters survive in her hand that let us hear her voice. No diary, no confidant's account, no description by anyone who knew her well enough to say what kind of woman she truly was. She left no portrait that we can certainly identify as hers, so that we cannot even look upon her face with any confidence. She passed through one of the best documented courts in European history, stood at the centre of its greatest drama, and left scarcely a personal trace, as though she had been a figure glimpsed at the edge of a great painting, present but unregarded. Her features left deliberately vague. This silence is not an accident, and it is not unique to her. It is the ordinary fate of women in her age, even women of the highest birth. The records of the 16th century were kept by men, and they recorded the doings of men, the wars and the offices and the lands and the lawsuits. A woman entered the written record chiefly at the great hinges of her life, when she was born, when she was married, when she bore an heir, when she died, and otherwise she lived in the wide unrecorded spaces between those entries, her days unchronicled, her thoughts unasked. A noblewoman might run a great household, raise the young who would shape the future, manage estates and influence, and the marriages of her kin, and leave behind her almost no words of her own. Elizabeth Howard was such a woman, and her silence is the silence of her whole sex and century, the vast quiet in which the lives of women were lived. There is a broader truth here, beyond the particular case of Elizabeth Howard, and it is worth naming, for she stands as one example among countless others. The history we inherit is, very largely, a history of men written by men about men, and the women who lived alongside them, who bore and raised them, who ran the households and shaped the families and held the social fabric together, have been allowed to slip into the margins, named when they were born and married and died, and otherwise passing unrecorded through the great events of their times. For every famous man of the past, there stood mothers and wives and daughters whose lives were as real and as full as his, and who have left almost no trace. To recover such a woman, to reconstruct her from the fragments, to insist that she mattered and that her life is worth attending to, is to do a small act of restoration, to fill in a little of the vast blank that the record has left where half of humanity should be. Elizabeth Howard is one such blank, a real and consequential woman reduced to a name and a shadow, and in spending this evening with her we are doing, in a small way, the work of remembering that history has so consistently failed to do. And so to tell her story honestly, we must do something a little unusual. We must reconstruct her from the world around her, from the shape of the spaces she moved through, From what we know of women of her rank in general, and from the few hard facts of her particular life, we must read her in her family, in her famous children who carried her blood and something of her nature, in the great houses she ran, and the court she served, and the catastrophe she survived. It is a portrait assembled from edges and reflections rather than painted from the life, and I will be honest with you, all through this evening, about where the firm ground ends and the careful inference begins. But it is worth doing, this patient reconstruction, because the woman who emerges is not a footnote to her children's fame. She is a person in her own right, and her life, rightly seen, holds a quiet and terrible power. So let us begin where her life began, with the blood she was born to, and the great name that was hers before ever she became a Boleyn. Elizabeth Howard came into the world around the year 1480, and she was born a Howard, and in the England of her day there were few prouder things to be. We must set aside for a moment everything we know about what the Boleyns would become, because when Elizabeth was a girl, the Boleyns were nobody very much, a rising family of merchant origins still climbing toward real consequence, while the Howards were ancient and mighty, one of the very greatest houses in the kingdom. It is one of the quiet ironies of her story that the famous name came to her by marriage, while the truly grand name was the one she came into and gradually surrendered. She began life higher than she would spend most of it, the daughter of a duke in the making, and the dignity of her birth shaped everything that followed. Her father was Thomas Howard, a man who would become one of the most formidable figures of the age. In Elizabeth's childhood, his family was under a cloud, for the Howards had backed the losing side at the battle that put the first Tudor king upon the throne, and they had suffered for it, stripped of their dukedom and cast down. But Thomas Howard was not a man to stay down. He clawed his way back into royal favour by sheer ability and dogged loyalty, and he would in time recover the family's lost glory and more, becoming the second Duke of Norfolk and winning, late in life, a great victory in the north against the Scots that sealed his fame. He was hard, capable, and tenacious, a soldier and a survivor, and his daughter Elizabeth seems to have inherited a measure of that Howard steel, the quality that would let her endure what was coming without breaking. Yet her mother was Elizabeth Tilney, a gentlewoman of good birth and considerable connection, and through both her parents the young Elizabeth Howard was woven into the dense and intricate web of the English aristocracy. The great noble families of that world were bound together by blood and marriage into a single extended kindred, cousins and in-laws reaching across the realm, and a Howard girl stood near the centre of that web. She could count earls and dukes among her relations, and behind them, further back, the blood of kings, for the Howards traced their descent, as so many of the high nobility did, into the royal line of medieval England. To be born a Howard was to enter the innermost circle of the realm, with a claim to be treated as the equal of almost anyone in the land below the throne itself. The Howard house into which she came would remain, throughout her life, one of the great powers of the realm, and her connection to it was the deepest fact of her identity. Her brother would become in time the third Duke of Norfolk, one of the most powerful and ruthless men in England, a fixture at the court of Henry VIII for decades, a survivor of every turn of fortune. The Howards were a family of immense consequence and immense durability, who weathered the storms that destroyed so many others, who bent and survived where lesser families broke. They were also, it must be said, a family that put its own survival above almost everything, capable of sacrificing its own members to preserve the whole, as Elizabeth would learn to her cost when her Howard brother presided over the trial that condemned her children. To be a Howard was to belong to this mighty, enduring, and coldly self-preserving house, and Elizabeth carried that belonging all her life, born to it, married away from it in name, and returned to it at the last in death. The Howard blood was the constant beneath the changing surface of her life, the deep identity that underlay the Boleyn marriage and all that came of it. It is worth pausing on what that meant for a girl, because it is easy to imagine that high birth was simply a blessing, a cushion of privilege. It was that, but it was also a weight and a duty. A daughter of a great house was not her own person to dispose of as she wished. She was an asset of the family, a piece in the long game of dynastic advancement, and her chief value lay in the marriage she would one day make, the alliance her body would seal, the children she would bear to carry the blood onward. From her earliest years she would have understood that her life was not entirely hers, that she existed within a structure of expectation and obligation, that their honour rested in part upon her conduct, and that she would be given, in due course, to whatever match would best serve the house. This was the iron logic of her world, and a Howard girl absorbed it with the air she breathed. And so the small Elizabeth grew up inside a particular kind of knowledge, the knowledge of exactly who she was and what was owed to her name. She would have been raised to a sense of her own consequence, taught to carry herself as befitted her blood, to understand precedence and rank and the elaborate gradations of deference that governed her world. But she would also have been raised to obedience, to the understanding that her grand birth came bound to grand obligations, and that the day would come when her family would use her, as families used their daughters, to forge an alliance and advance their fortunes. When that day came, the man chosen for her would not be a duke or an earl. He would be a clever, ambitious, well-to-do courtier named Thomas Boleyn, a man of rising fortune but lesser blood, and in marrying him the proud Howard heiress would begin the strange descent and stranger ascent that would carry her, by way of her own children, to the very edge of the throne and then into the heart of catastrophe. What was it like, the girlhood of a great noble daughter in the England of the 1480s and 90s, the world in which Elizabeth Howard grew toward womanhood? We have no account of her particular childhood, but we can reconstruct its shape with some confidence, because the upbringing of girls of her class followed well-worn patterns, and it was an upbringing designed not to develop the individual, but to produce a certain kind of woman fit to take her place as the wife of a great man and the mistress of a large house. She would have spent her earliest years in the women's part of the household, among nurses and waiting women, and the other children of the family, in a world of warmth and milk and the close attendance of servants. A girl of her rank was a precious thing, guarded and tended, and her infancy would have been comfortable in the material sense, though the age was a perilous one for children, and the shadow of early death lay over every nursery, however grand. Many children of the nobility did not live to grow up, carried off by the fevers and fluxes and sudden sicknesses, against which the medicine of the day was nearly helpless. And Elizabeth would have grown up knowing, as all children of that world knew, that small graves were a part of family life, that brothers and sisters might be there one season and gone the next. As she grew, her education would have begun, and it would have been an education aimed squarely at her future. She would have been taught, first of all, the domestic arts that a noblewoman was expected to command, for the mistress of a noble household was the manager of a considerable enterprise, responsible for the running of an establishment that might number scores of servants. The ordering of food and stores, the making and keeping of linen and clothing, the supervision of still room and dairy and kitchen, the care of the sick within her gates. These were not trivial skills. To run a noble house well was a serious and demanding business, and a girl was trained to it from childhood, learning at her mother's side and her governess's hand the 1,000 details of domestic command. She would have learned too the accomplishments that marked a gentlewoman, the things that made her ornamental as well as useful. She would have learned to sew and embroider with skill, for needlework was the universal occupation of noblewomen, filling the long hours and producing the rich furnishings that adorned a noble house. She would have learned to dance, and to carry herself with grace, and perhaps to sing or to play upon an instrument, for music was prized at court and in the houses of the mighty. She would have learned to ride, for the nobility lived much in the saddle, and a lady was expected to keep her seat on a horse. And she would have absorbed the elaborate code of manners and precedents that governed her station, the curtsies and the courtesies, the careful gradations of respect owed to those above and demanded from those below. There was, woven through all of this, the deep fabric of religion. For the England Elizabeth grew up in was a Catholic one, and the faith of the old church shaped every day and every season of a noble childhood. She would have been raised to the rhythms of devotion, the daily prayers, the Mass, the observance of the holy days, and the fasts that marked the calendar, the whole rich apparatus of medieval piety that governed the year. A great house had its chapel and its chaplain, and the religious life of the household was a part of its daily order, the family gathering for worship, the seasons turning through Advent and Christmas and Lent and Easter, the saints' days observed, the candles lit. The girl absorbed this faith as the very ground of her existence, unquestioned and all-encompassing, the framework within which the whole of life was lived and understood. It is one of the strange ironies of Elizabeth's story that she was raised in this old, settled, Catholic faith, and that her own daughter would become the occasion for its overthrow in England, the breaking of the very church in which the mother had been reared. But that lay far ahead. In Elizabeth's girlhood, the old faith stood unchallenged, eternal as it seemed, and she was formed within it. What she would not have received, in all likelihood, was much in the way of book learning. This was a generation before the new fashion, for educating noblewomen took hold. Elizabeth Howard belonged to an older world, in which a noblewoman was not expected to be a scholar, and she may have had only a modest grasp of letters, enough to read her prayers and keep her accounts and write a simple hand, but not the deep classical learning that would later be lavished upon clever daughters. It is one of the interesting facts about her family that her own daughters would be given a far finer education than she herself had likely enjoyed, sent abroad to the most cultured courts in Europe, and polished to a brilliance their mother never knew. In this, as in much else, Elizabeth stood on the threshold of a changing age, raised in the old way, mother to children raised in the new. We should understand, too, that a young woman like Elizabeth was, in the cold reckoning of her world, a valuable property, and that her value lay precisely in her blood and her connections. A Howard daughter brought to any marriage the alliance of one of the greatest families in England, a web of kinship that reached into the highest circles of the realm, and this made her a prize in the marriage market of the nobility, a maiden whose hand could seal an important alliance or reward a rising man. Her family would have weighed her marriage carefully, considering what each possible match might bring, what alliance it might forge, what advantage it might secure, for the marriage of a daughter was one of the chief instruments by which a great family advanced its interests and extended its influence. She grew up knowing, however dimly, that she was such an instrument, that her marriage would be a matter of family policy rather than personal choice, that she would be given where her blood would do the most good. This was not cruelty, but simply the way of her world, the logic by which the nobility ordered itself, and a girl absorbed it as a fact of life, understanding that her own desires counted for little against the interests of the house, and that the day would come when she would be matched, as a valuable asset is matched, to the advantage of her family. Above all, her girlhood was a preparation for marriage, an apprenticeship for the role she was destined to fill. Everything she learned pointed toward the day when she would be given to a husband and become the mistress of a household of her own, and she would have grown up understanding that this was her purpose, the end to which her whole upbringing was directed. She was being made ready, year by year, to be handed over, and somewhere in the unfolding of the 1490s, as she came toward the age when noble girls were married, her family began to consider the question of whom she should be given to. The answer they arrived at would surprise no one who understood the calculations of the age, and disappoint anyone who imagined that a Howard girl must marry a man as grand as herself. The man chosen for Elizabeth Howard was Thomas Boleyn, and to understand that match we must understand the curious arithmetic of it, because at first glance it looks like a step down for a daughter of so great a house. He was not a nobleman. He came from a family that had risen within living memory from trade. His great-grandfather had been a hatter and a mercer in Norfolk, a man of the merchant class who had made money and bought land, and begun the long climb upward that his descendants continued. By his own day they were solid and prosperous gentry, landed and respectable, with a fine seat at Hever in Kent and connections at court. But they were not of the old blood, not of the charmed circle into which Elizabeth had been born. For a Howard to marry into that family was, in the strict reckoning of rank, for so high a lady to marry beneath her. And yet the match made excellent sense, and it was made for reasons that were entirely characteristic of the age. The Boleyns had money, and the Howards, for all their grandeur, were not always rich, for great families could be land poor and burdened with the enormous expense of living as their dignity required. A marriage that brought Boleyn wealth into the Howard orbit was not to be despised, and the bridegroom himself was a young man of remarkable promise, clever, ambitious, accomplished, fluent in languages, skilled in the arts of the court, plainly destined to rise. A shrewd family might see in such a man not a come-down, but an investment, a rising star to whom it was worth tying a daughter, in the expectation that he would climb and carry her up with him. And so the match was made, somewhere around the turn of the century, the great Howard heiress given to the ambitious Boleyn heir, her blood and his fortune and his talent joined together in the hope of mutual advancement. For Thomas Boleyn, the marriage was a triumph, and he knew it. To win a daughter of the Howards was a coup for a man of his standing, a leap into the kindred of the high nobility, a connection that would open doors and lend him consequence for the rest of his life. He would later boast in his fashion of the grandeur of his marriage, and he had reason to, for it was the foundation of much that followed. The Howard connection gave him entry and standing, marked him as a man allied to the great, and helped to lift him in the eyes of the court. Whatever else can be said of Thomas Boleyn, and much that is unflattering can be said of him, he understood the value of what his wife brought him, and he built upon it with relentless skill. A noble marriage in that age was not the private affair of two people, but a public joining of two families, and the wedding itself would have been an occasion of some ceremony, the sealing of a contract negotiated between the houses, with its settlements of land and money, its careful provisions for dower and inheritance, all the legal scaffolding that surrounded the union of property and blood. The bride brought her dowry, the groom his settlement, and lawyers and elders on both sides hammered out the terms before ever the couple stood together. And then there was the wedding, the joining of hands, the nuptial mass, the feasting, the public acknowledgement that the two were now one flesh and the two families now allied. For a young woman, the marriage meant a translation into a new life, the leaving of her father's house for her husband's, the assumption of a new role and a new household, the beginning of the work of wifehood, and soon enough of motherhood. She passed through this great transition as noblewomen did, given by her family to her husband, translated from a Howard girl into a Boleyn wife, and set down in a new life whose central labour would be the bearing and raising of the next generation. What marriage meant for Elizabeth herself is harder to know because here, as so often, the record is silent on her feelings. We do not know whether she went to her husband willingly or reluctantly, whether she found him pleasing or merely tolerable, whether the match was to her a disappointment, A Howard daughter handed to a lesser man, or a satisfaction, a clever and rising husband who promised a brilliant future. We know only that she married him as noble women married because her family arranged it, and that she became, by that marriage, Elizabeth Boleyn, mistress of Hever, wife to one of the most ambitious men in England. The girl who had been a Howard was now a Boleyn wife, and the great name receded behind the rising one, and her life as a wife and a mother began. We can say a little, though, about the kind of man she had married, because Thomas Boleyn is well documented, and the picture is not entirely warm. He was able, certainly one of the most accomplished diplomats and courtiers of his generation, trusted with delicate embassies and high offices, a man who could hold his own in the most sophisticated courts of Europe. He was also, by every account, cold, calculating, and consumed by ambition, a man who measured people by their usefulness and pursued advancement with a single-mindedness that few could match. He would prove willing, in the end, to profit from his daughter's rise without lifting a hand to save them in their fall, a father whose self-preservation outran his love. This was the man to whom Elizabeth Howard was bound for life, and with whom she would build a family and a fortune and in time share a catastrophe. We should try to picture the long shape of this marriage, for it endured for the better part of 4 decades, through all the years of their rise and into the catastrophe of its fall. It began around the turn of the century and lasted until Elizabeth's death in 1538, nearly 40 years of shared life, of children born and raised and lost, of fortunes climbed and dignities won, of a family built together from comfortable obscurity to the summit of the kingdom. Whatever the marriage was in its emotional texture, and of that we know nothing, it was a long and consequential partnership, a joint enterprise that succeeded beyond all reasonable hope, and then collapsed in the most terrible way. Through all those years, Elizabeth was Thomas Boleyn's wife, the mother of his children, the mistress of his houses, the sharer of his rise, bound to him by the indissoluble tie of marriage and by the home they had made together. It was the central relationship of her adult life, the frame within which everything else happened, and it ran the whole length of her story, from the wedding of a Howard girl to a climbing courtier, to the grief of an old countess who had lost her children, 2 people yoked together through one of the most extraordinary family histories of their age. And so a partnership began, of a sort, between the highborn wife and the climbing husband, a partnership in the great Tudor enterprise of getting on. We should not imagine it as a marriage of the heart, though there may have been affection in it, for we cannot tell. We should imagine it rather as the founding of a joint venture, 2 people of complementary assets joined to advance a family, her blood and his brains and both their fertility set to work in the long campaign of rising in the world. In the years that followed, that venture would prosper beyond anything they could have dreamed, and then it would destroy itself, and Elizabeth would be there for all of it, the still centre around which the storm of the Boleyns gathered and broke. In the years that followed her marriage, Elizabeth Boleyn did what a wife of her time was above all expected to do. She bore children, and she bore them in number, for the early years of the marriage were fruitful ones, and a succession of babies came into the world at the Boleyn houses, at Blickling in Norfolk and at Hever in Kent. Childbearing was the central business of a noblewoman's life, the duty for which she had been raised and the service by which she earned her place, and Elizabeth performed it again and again through the first decade and more of her married life, passing through the long round of pregnancy and confinement and delivery and recovery that filled the fertile years of women of her age. We cannot be entirely sure how many children she bore, because the records of these births are imperfect, but it seems clear that she brought more children into the world than survived to grow up. The 3 we remember, Mary and Anne and George, were the ones who lived, but there appear to have been others who did not, infants who came and were christened and were buried, small lives that flickered and went out, as so many did in that pitiless age. This was the ordinary grief of motherhood in the 16th century, a grief almost no family escaped. To be a mother then was to expect to bury some of your children, to know that the nursery was a place of risk as well as of joy, that a child healthy one week might be carried off the next by a sickness no one could name or cure. Elizabeth, like nearly every mother of her time, almost certainly knew this sorrow, the small coffin and the fresh grief, more than once. We should not pass too lightly over what childbearing meant for a woman of that age, because it was the central labour and the central danger of a noblewoman's life. Every pregnancy carried real risk, for childbirth was perilous in a time before any of the medicine that would later make it safe, and women died in considerable numbers in the bearing of their children, carried off by hemorrhage or by the fevers that followed delivery, dying young in the very act of bringing life into the world. A woman who bore as many children as Elizabeth bore passed through that danger again and again, faced death each time she came to her confinement, knew with each pregnancy that she might not survive it, and the babies themselves were fragile, vulnerable in their first hours and days and months to 100 mortal threats, so that to bear a child was no guarantee of raising one. The fertile season of a woman's life was thus lived under a double shadow, the danger to herself and the danger to the child, and Elizabeth lived that season as her contemporaries did, in the recurring ordeal of pregnancy and birth, with the constant nearness of death, woven into the very work of motherhood. That she survived her many confinements, and raised 3 children to adulthood, was itself a kind of fortune in an age when so many mothers and so many infants did not. The exact order and dating of her surviving children's births is one of the famously vexed questions of Tudor history, debated by scholars without final resolution, but the broad picture is clear enough. Mary appears to have been the first of the 3 who lived, or close to it. Anne came next, or thereabouts, and George somewhat later, though the precise sequence and the exact dates remain uncertain. What matters for our purposes is simply that across the first part of the new century, Elizabeth bore and raised a family, that by the time her childbearing years were done, she had 3 living children, 2 daughters and a son, and that these 3 would carry her blood and her family's name to a height and then to a ruin that no one in those early years could have begun to imagine. Picture her then, in these years, a young matron in the fullness of her duties, her days given over to the unending work of running a household and raising a family. She would have nursed her pregnancies and her recoveries, supervised the care of her children, overseen the wet nurses and the rockers and the nursery maids who did the daily labour of tending the very young. She would have watched her children take their first steps and speak their first words, watched them grow from infants into children, begun to see in them the persons they would become. And all the while she would have been running the great machine of the household, the cooking and the cleaning and the brewing and the storing, the management of servants and stores, and all the elaborate apparatus of noble domestic life. It was a full and demanding existence, and it was the existence for which her whole girlhood had prepared her. The 3 children she raised grew up close, bound together by the ties of a shared childhood, and the bond between them would prove one of the defining features of the household. Mary and Anne and George were near in age, raised together in the same houses, sharing the same early world, and they grew into a tightly knit trio, loyal to one another and to the Boleyn enterprise of which they were all a part. Anne and George in particular seem to have been especially close, brother and sister bound by a deep affection and a shared brilliance, a closeness that would later be twisted by their enemies into the monstrous accusation that destroyed them both. This intimacy among her children was Elizabeth's creation, in a sense the fruit of the brood she had made and the home she had built, the warm web of sibling love that bound the 3 together. and it would be the source of unbearable pain, for the very closeness of the children meant that their fates were entangled, that the destruction of one drew in another, that Anne and George went to their deaths together, brother and sister, the bond of their childhood becoming the occasion of their shared doom. The loving family that Elizabeth had made was strong and close, and its strength and closeness, in the end, were part of what destroyed it. There is something worth dwelling on here, which is that these years, the years of bearing and raising her children, were almost certainly the central and defining work of Elizabeth's life, and yet they are precisely the years of which we know least. The great dramas that would make her family famous lay in the future. In these early years she was simply a wife and a mother, doing the ordinary, extraordinary work of bringing the next generation into being, and that work, because it was women's work and domestic work, left almost no mark on the record. We can be sure she did it, because her children existed, but the texture of it, the long days and broken nights, the particular love she bore each child, the small triumphs and griefs of a mother's life, all of that has vanished, as the inner lives of women so consistently vanished from the chronicles of that age. And yet it was here, in these unrecorded years, that the most important thing she ever did was done. For in raising Mary and Anne and George, shaping them in their earliest years, in giving them whatever she could of character and capacity and ambition, Elizabeth Boleyn was forming the figures who would change the history of England. The hand that rocked those cradles set in motion, though it could not have known it, the chain of events that would break a kingdom from the Roman Church and place a granddaughter of hers upon the throne. The work looked humble, the daily work of a mother in her nursery, and it was the most consequential work imaginable. So let us turn now to the setting where so much of that work was done, to the house that was the heart of the Boleyn world, to Hever. Hever Castle was the heart of the Boleyn world, and to understand Elizabeth's daily life we must spend a little while inside its walls. It was not a castle in the warlike sense, despite the name, not a stronghold bristling with defences, but a fortified manor house, a comfortable and handsome dwelling that had grown up around an older defensive core. It sat within a double moat in a quiet wooded valley of the Kentish Weald, surrounded by the soft green countryside of orchards and hop gardens and gentle hills, far from the noise of London though near enough to reach it when need arose. A gatehouse with a drawbridge guarded the entrance, and within lay a courtyard and ranges of buildings, the hall and the chambers and the offices, all the apparatus of a prosperous gentleman's seat. Within its walls, Elizabeth presided over a world of her own making, for the mistress of such an establishment was its ruler in all the domestic sphere. The great hall would have been the heart of it, where the household gathered and ate, hung with whatever tapestries and hangings their growing wealth could provide, warmed by a roaring fire whose smoke rose into the high roof. Beyond the hall lay the more private chambers, the parlours and bedchambers where the Boleyns lived their less public hours, increasingly comfortable and richly furnished as the Boleyn fortunes rose with panelled walls and glazed windows and the good furniture that marked a prosperous home. And below and behind all this lay the working parts of the building, the kitchens and butteries and pantries, the brewhouse and bakehouse, the still room and the dairy, the entire apparatus of provision that kept a large household fed and clothed and supplied. Beyond the moat lay the working estate, the lands and farms and tenants that sustained their wealth, for a great seat did not stand alone but at the centre of an entire rural economy. There were the home farm and the demesne lands, the woods and fields and pastures, the mills and barns and the labour of the countryside that fed it and filled its coffers. Then there were the tenants who held their land of the Lord, and paid their rents, and owed their dues, the villagers whose lives were bound up with the manor at the heart of their world. And there was the wider community of the parish, the church and the priest, the neighbours of the gentry class, The dense social fabric of the rural England in which Hever sat. The mistress of such a place was a figure of consequence in this little world, a dispenser of charity and a manager of affairs, her household the chief employer and the social centre of the neighbourhood. Her domain was not merely the rooms of the manor, but this whole small kingdom of land and people, and her position within it was one of real authority and real responsibility, a figure of standing at the head of a rural community that looked to it for their order and their livelihood. The rhythm of life in such a house followed the turning of the year and the round of the day, and it was a rhythm Elizabeth governed. There was the daily cycle of meals, the constant business of feeding the household, which in a place of any size was a considerable undertaking, the dinner at midday and the supper in the evening, the provisioning and cooking and serving, that occupied a small army of servants under the mistress's eye. There was the seasonal cycle of the countryside, the slaughtering and salting in autumn, the brewing and baking, the making and mending of linen, the laying in of stores against the winter. There was the religious cycle of the year, the holy days and the fasts and the great feasts of the church calendar, observed in the household chapel and marking the passage of the seasons. And through all of it moved the mistress of the place, directing and overseeing the still centre of a complex and ceaseless domestic enterprise. It was, we should remember, a life lived very largely among women. The world of the great house was divided, in its way, between the masculine sphere of estate and office and the wider world, and the feminine sphere of the household, and the nursery, and the daily domestic round. Elizabeth's days would have been spent largely in the company of other women, her waiting gentlewomen and her servants, the female society that filled the private chambers of a noble house. Here the work of the household was planned and done, the sewing and the supervision, the care of the children and the sick, the small commerce of a women's world. It was within this sphere that a woman of Elizabeth's rank exercised real authority, ran a genuine enterprise, and shaped the daily texture of the lives around her, and it was here, in all likelihood, that she was most herself. There was warmth and festivity in those rooms too, for all the work and order, and the year was punctuated by celebrations that lit up the round of labour. The great feasts of the Christian calendar were occasions of real rejoicing. Christmas above all, the 12 days of feasting and games and misrule that brightened the dead of winter, when the hall was decked with greenery and the fire roared and the household gave itself over to merriment. There were the festivities of Easter and the celebrations of Whitsun, the marking of weddings and christenings and the visits of guests, the music and dancing that enlivened a great hall, the hunting and the hawking that were the recreations of the gentry. The mistress of the house presided over these pleasures as she presided over its labours, the warm and festive side of domestic life balancing the constant work of provision and management. We should not imagine Elizabeth's world at Hever as one of unrelieved toil and duty, for there was joy in it too, the joy of family and feast, and the turning seasons, the pleasures of a comfortable and prosperous life in a beautiful place. The children grew up amid these warmths and festivities, in a house that knew how to celebrate as well as to work, and the memory of those bright days at Hever must have been, in the dark years that came after, among the most precious and the most painful that Elizabeth possessed. And Hever was where the children grew. It was at Hever, above all, that Mary and Anne and George spent their early years, in the green peace of the Kentish countryside, before the wider world drew them out and away. We can imagine them there, 3 children in the courtyards and gardens and chambers of the moated house, playing and squabbling and growing, watched over by their mother and the nursery servants, learning the first lessons of their lives. It was an idyllic setting for a childhood, by the standards of the age safe and comfortable and beautiful, and it would remain, for all of them, the place they came from, the home at the centre of their lives. In later years, when their lives had carried them into the dangerous glamour of the court, Hever would be the place they returned to, the quiet green refuge behind the glitter. And it was here, in this house, that Elizabeth would one day come back to live out her broken final years, when the wider world had given her all the glory and all the grief it had to give. But now, though, in these early years, Hever was simply home, the comfortable seat of a rising family, the domain of a capable mistress, the nursery of children who did not yet know what they would become. She ran it, and lived in it, and raised her family within it, and her life in these years had the settled shape of a noblewoman's life, full of duty and occupation, bounded by the moat and the green hills, far from the dangerous centre of power. But the Boleyn fortunes were rising, carried up by the talent and ambition of Thomas Boleyn, and that rise would draw them, in time, toward the court, toward the king, toward the dazzling and perilous court, in which the rest of their story would be played out. And Elizabeth, the great Howard heiress, was no stranger to that world, for she had a place in it of her own. For Elizabeth Boleyn was not merely the mistress of a country house. She was a noblewoman with a place at the royal court, and in the years of the young King Henry VIII's reign she served for a time among the ladies of his queen, Catherine of Aragon. This was the natural sphere of a woman of her birth and her husband's rising consequence, and it placed her early on within the glittering inner world of the Tudor monarchy, attending upon the Queen of England in the great houses and palaces where the court held its endless, dazzling, dangerous round. The court of Henry VIII in those early years was one of the most brilliant in Europe, presided over by a young king in the first flush of his reign, handsome and athletic and accomplished, a lover of music and sport and display, and by his queen, Catherine of Aragon, the dignified and devout daughter of the sovereigns of Spain. It was a world of magnificence and ceremony, of feasts and dances and tournaments, of rich clothing and elaborate ritual, of music and poetry, and the constant performance of magnificence that the age expected of its rulers. To serve at such a court was to live at the very centre of the kingdom's life, in the presence of its greatest figures, amid a splendour designed to overawe. To attend upon the Queen as one of her ladies was a position of honour and a serious occupation. The Queen was surrounded by a household of noble and gentle women who served her in the daily intimacy of her chambers, attending her person, keeping her company, sharing in the elaborate routine of a royal lady's day. They would help her dress in the morning, in the layered and complex clothing of a queen, and attend her through her devotions and her meals and her recreations, her walks and her needlework and her music. They would accompany her on the great public occasions when the court displayed itself, and share in the private hours of the Queen's more retired life. It was a service that demanded discretion, grace, and a perfect command of the elaborate manners of the court, and a woman of Elizabeth's breeding was well fitted for it. The service of a Queen's lady was a thing of close and daily intimacy, and to understand Elizabeth's years at court we must picture the texture of it. The Queen lived surrounded by her women, and they shared in the whole round of her day, from the rising in the morning to the retiring at night. They were present at her dressing, helping her into the elaborate layers of a queen's attire, the shift and the kirtle and the gown, the sleeves and the hood and the jewels, the whole magnificent apparatus of royal clothing. They attended her at her devotions, kneeling with her at mass and prayers, for Catherine of Aragon was a woman of deep and serious piety, whose religious observances filled a great part of her day. They sat with her at her needlework, that universal occupation of noblewomen, the Queen and her ladies sewing together in the long hours, making the shirts and the altar cloths and the fine embroidered things that were the products of a royal workroom. They walked with her in the gardens, played and sang and read with her, kept her company through the public ceremonies and the private hours alike. It was a life of constant attendance, of intimate service to the First Lady of the kingdom, and it placed Elizabeth in daily proximity to the Queen and to the whole inner life of the court, a witness to the private, as well as the public face of royal power. We know that Elizabeth was present at court, named among those who took part in its festivities, for the records of the great court entertainments occasionally preserve the names of the ladies who danced in the pageants and masques that were so beloved of the young king. To picture her, we must picture those occasions, the great hall transformed for a revel, the candles blazing, the music playing, the court arrayed in its finery, and among the ladies of the Queen, taking her part in the dance, the Howard girl who was now a Boleyn wife, moving through the patterns of a courtly entertainment in the presence of the King and Queen of England. It is one of the few glimpses we have of her as a living, moving figure, and it places her squarely in the brilliant world that would in time consume her family. The court was also, beneath its glittering surface, a place of intense and perilous competition, and to move within it was to live in a world of constant calculation. Every great family at court was engaged in the endless struggle for the king's favour, for the offices and grants and honours that flowed from royal goodwill, and the rivalries between them were fierce and unceasing. Factions formed and dissolved, alliances were made and broken, men and women rose and fell on the tides of the king's affection and the manoeuvring of the powerful. To survive and prosper in such a place required a watchful intelligence, a mastery of the unwritten rules, an instinct for where power lay and which way the wind was blowing. A lady of rank at court was a player in this game, whether she wished to be or not, her family's fortunes bound up with the shifting currents of favour, her own conduct and connections a part of the larger struggle. She moved in this world, watched it, learned its ways, and the knowledge she gained there of how the court worked, how favour was won and lost, how the mighty could be cast down, would have been a part of the wisdom she carried through her life, even as she could do nothing, in the end, to save her own children from the deadly machinery she had seen at work. Her service to Catherine of Aragon carries a particular poignancy when we consider what was to come, for the Queen whom Elizabeth attended in these early years was the very woman whom her own daughter would one day displace. Catherine of Aragon was Henry's first wife, married to him for many years, the mother of his daughter Mary, a queen beloved by the people, and secure, as it seemed, in her place. And Elizabeth Boleyn served her, attended her, was one of the gentlewomen of her court, in the days before anyone could have imagined that the king would ever set this queen aside. The thought that her own dark-eyed daughter Anne would one day take Catherine's place, that the breaking of the Queen Elizabeth served would be accomplished through the rise of the child Elizabeth bore, lay far in an unimaginable future. In these years they were simply queen and attendant lady, and Elizabeth moved in Catherine's orbit as a matter of course, a great lady doing the service her rank required. This early experience of the court would have taught Elizabeth a great deal, and it is worth considering what she learned there, because the lessons of the court were hard ones. She would have learned how power worked at the centre of the kingdom, how favour was won and lost, how the smiles of the great could turn to frowns, how precarious even the highest position could be. She would have seen the glamour and felt the danger, understood the rules of the game that was played in those gilded chambers, the game of advancement and survival, in which the stakes were everything, and she would carry that knowledge with her through the years that followed, as her own family was drawn ever deeper into the dangerous world of the court, until the day when the lessons she had learned as a young attendant of Catherine of Aragon would be played out, with unimaginable cruelty, upon her own children. If there is one thing for which Elizabeth Boleyn deserves to be remembered above all, beyond the famous children she bore, it is perhaps the children she raised, and the kind of women she helped to make of the girls. For Mary and Anne Boleyn did not become what they became by accident. They were shaped, in their early years, into accomplished and capable women, fit to move in the highest circles, and that shaping began at home under their mother's eye in the years before the wider world took them up. We do not know the details of how Elizabeth raised the girls, but we can see the results, and the results are striking. But both girls grew up to be poised, cultivated, and self-possessed, able to hold their own in the most sophisticated courts in Europe, and Anne in particular became one of the most brilliant and accomplished women of her age, witty, stylish, musically gifted, fluent in French, a mistress of all the arts of courtly life. Such qualities did not come from nowhere. They were the fruit of a careful upbringing, of an early grounding in the accomplishments and manners that a noblewoman required, and that early grounding was given at home, in the years at Hever and Blickling, by the mother who oversaw their first education. And then, in a decision that would shape everything, the daughters were sent abroad. This was the great gift the family gave its children, and it reflected both the ambition of Thomas Boleyn and the rising fortunes of the Boleyns. For to send daughters to be educated at the courts of Europe was an expensive and prestigious thing, a mark of high aspiration. Mary and then Anne were sent across the sea to be finished at the most cultured courts of the continent, to acquire the polish and the languages and the accomplishments that would fit them for great marriages and high places. Anne went first to the court of the Archduchess Margaret in the Low Countries, and then to the French court, where she spent years absorbing the brilliance of the most sophisticated society in Europe, and came home at last transformed into something dazzling and new, a woman of French elegance and wit, unlike anything the English court had seen. The court of France, to which Anne was sent, was the most brilliant and sophisticated in Europe, a place of dazzling culture and refinement, and the years she spent there transformed her utterly. She served in the household of the French queen, moved in a world of poetry and music and fashion and wit, absorbed the manners and the style and the language of the most cultivated society of the age. She learned to dress and to dance and to converse in the French manner, to carry herself with a continental elegance, to deploy the arts of charm and accomplishment that the French court prized above all. By the time she returned to England, she was a creature of that world, marked by it, polished to a brilliance that set her apart from the homelier women of the English court. The girl who had left a Kentish manor house came back a French woman in all but birth, and the difference would be the making of her, for it was precisely this exotic, sophisticated allure that would one day captivate a king. She had sent away a child and received back, years later, a stranger of dazzling accomplishment, a daughter remade by a foreign court into something the mother could scarcely have imagined, and the remaking was their investment, come to fruition, the polished instrument of its highest ambitions. For a mother, the sending away of one's children is always a wrench, and we may imagine that Elizabeth felt it, watching the girls carried off across the sea to distant courts, to be raised for years by others, in the knowledge that they would return changed, half-strangers made into women she had not quite formed. This was the cost of ambition, the price of their rise, that the young must be given up to the wider world, sent away to be polished into instruments of their advancement. It was done for love, in its way, and for ambition, the two so tangled together in that world as to be inseparable, and it was the making of the girls. But it must have been hard too, the long absences, the children growing up far away, the letters and the rare reunions, the sense of a family scattered across the courts of Europe in pursuit of greatness. There is a question that hangs over all of this, which we can raise but not answer, and it is the question of what Elizabeth wanted for the girls, and whether she had any part in the great decisions that shaped their fates. Did she share her husband's soaring ambition, or did she watch it with unease? Did she dream, as he surely did, of the heights her clever daughters might reach, or did she fear the dangerous game they were playing, the courting of royal favour that could raise so high and cast down so far? We cannot know, because she left us no word. But it is hard not to wonder whether a mother, watching her daughters drawn deeper into the perilous orbit of the king, felt otherwise from the cold calculation of Thomas Boleyn, whether beneath the ambition there ran, in her, a current of maternal fear. It is natural to wonder how much of what the daughters became they owed to their mother. What of Elizabeth lived on in Anne and Mary, and though we cannot trace it with certainty, we can speculate with some reason. The Howard blood that Elizabeth carried was a blood of pride and tenacity and a certain hard strength, the qualities that had let her father claw his way back from disgrace, and something of that strength seems to have passed to her children, most of all to Anne, who showed in her rise and even in her fall a remarkable nerve and resolve, the capacity to hold a course against great pressure, to play a long and dangerous game, to face even death with composure. These were qualities Anne possessed in abundance, and they may have been in part her mother's gift, the Howard steel passed down through the female line. And there was, perhaps, something of grace and accomplishment too, the arts of the lady of consequence that Elizabeth had mastered and passed on, the foundation of manner and bearing on which the French polish was later laid. We cannot know how much of the daughter was the mother's making, but it is reasonable to think that Anne Boleyn, that extraordinary woman, owed something essential to the forgotten woman who bore and first shaped her, and that in the daughter's brilliance we catch a reflected glimpse of the mother we can otherwise barely see. There is a hard truth folded into all of this, which is that the very gifts Elizabeth helped to give her daughters were the gifts that drew them toward destruction. The poise, the brilliance, the allure, the accomplishment that fitted them to move among the great, were precisely what caught the eye of a king and carried them into the deadly orbit of the throne. A duller, plainer pair of girls might have made safe marriages to country gentlemen and lived out quiet lives far from the centre of power, and lived perhaps to old age. It was their brightness that doomed them, and that brightness was in part their mother's doing. There is no blame in this, for no one could have foreseen where it would lead, and Elizabeth did only what every ambitious mother of her class did, which was to make her daughters as splendid as she could. But there is a terrible irony in it all the same, that the love and care that shaped them so finely were, in the end, among the things that destroyed them, and that the mother who gave them their brilliance would live to see that brilliance consumed. There is a shadow that falls across Elizabeth Howard's name, and I want to address it directly, because to leave it unspoken would be to let a slander stand by silence, and she has suffered enough from the carelessness of history without our adding to it. For there arose long after her death a vile and almost certainly false rumour about her, and it is a rumour that tells us a great deal, not about Elizabeth, but about the cruelty of the age that produced it, and the ease with which a woman's name could be blackened. The rumour was this, that the king himself, Henry VIII, had been her lover, and that he had fathered one or more of her children. It was a poisonous suggestion, and it was made decades after the events, by a hostile writer of the next generation, a Catholic polemicist with every reason to blacken the Boleyns and to paint the whole family, and the Queen who came of it, in the foulest possible colours. The charge was that Henry had taken his pleasure with the mother before ever he took up with the daughters, and the most monstrous version of the slander even suggested that Anne Boleyn herself was the king's own child, which would have made his marriage to her a horror beyond imagining. It was propaganda of the basest kind designed to defame, and there is no credible evidence for any of it. Let us be clear about how little it stands on. It was written long after Elizabeth was dead and could not answer it, by a man who was not present, who had no source for it, and who had powerful motives to invent it. There is no contemporary record of any such relationship, no hint of it in the gossip of the court that missed very little, no sign of it in the voluminous documentation of the period. When the slander about Anne being the king's daughter was raised in Henry's own lifetime, it is recorded that the king himself dismissed it with contempt, for he knew perfectly well it was false. The whole thing was a later confection, a piece of hostile myth-making, and serious historians give it no weight at all. Elizabeth Howard was not the king's mistress, and the rumour that she was tells us nothing true about her. But it tells us something important about her world, and that is why I raise it rather than passing over it. It shows us how a woman, and particularly a woman connected to a scandalous and hated family, could be defamed across the centuries. Her reputation made the plaything of men with axes to grind. She had the misfortune to be the mother of Anne Boleyn, the most hated and most slandered woman of her age, the woman whom a whole faction in England regarded as a witch and a whore and the destroyer of true religion. And the hatred that was poured upon the daughter splashed back upon the mother, so that Elizabeth too was dragged into the filth. Accused of crimes she never committed, her name blackened to serve the campaign against her child, she was a victim in death of the same machine of slander that had destroyed her daughter in life. The episode opens a window onto a harsh truth about the lives of women in that age, which is how terribly vulnerable a woman's reputation was, and how little defence she had against the slanders of the powerful or the malicious. A man was judged, in the main, by his deeds and his offices, but a woman was judged above all by her virtue, by the question of her chastity and her honour. And this made her reputation a fragile and precious thing, easily attacked and hard to defend. To accuse a woman of sexual misconduct was to strike at the very heart of her standing in the world, and such accusations, once made, were almost impossible to disprove, for how could a woman prove a negative, prove that she had not done what she was accused of doing? The whole machinery of honour and shame bore down on women with a particular weight, leaving them perpetually exposed to the weapon of slander, and we see this weapon used again and again in the history of the age, deployed against queens and commoners alike, a ready means of destroying a woman who had become inconvenient or hated. Anne herself would be destroyed by exactly such accusations, and the slander against her mother was of a piece with it. The same weapon turned against the same family, the blackening of a woman's honour used as an instrument of ruin. There is a particular injustice in this, which is worth feeling. Elizabeth Howard was, as far as we can tell, a perfectly respectable noblewoman, a wife and mother who did her duty, and ran her household, and served her queen, who did nothing to merit infamy. And yet because she was attached to a great scandal, because her daughter became the lightning rod for the religious passions of a divided age, she was posthumously defamed, made into a character in someone else's poisonous tale. The real woman, the actual Elizabeth, was lost behind the slander, just as she was lost behind the fame of her children, swallowed up in a narrative not of her own making. It is a double erasure, the forgetting of who she truly was, and the invention of a who she was not. And so I set the record straight, as far as it can be set straight, by saying plainly that the rumour was a lie, that there is no reason to believe a word of it, and that Elizabeth Howard deserves to be remembered as what she was, not as what her family's enemies invented. We will hear no more of the slander tonight. I raise it only to lay it down, to clear it away, so that we can see the woman beneath it more clearly. For the true story of Elizabeth Howard is dramatic enough and tragic enough without the addition of malicious fictions. It is the story of a mother who rose with her children to the summit of the kingdom and then watched the kingdom destroy them, and we return to it now, in the years when their great ascent was gathering pace, carried upward by the relentless ambition of the man she had married. No, no. While Elizabeth bore and raised her children and ran her household, her husband was climbing, and his climb is the rising ground on which the rest of her life stands. Thomas Boleyn was one of the most successful courtiers of his generation, and his success was the engine that drew the whole family upward out of the comfortable obscurity of the Kentish gentry and into the dangerous brilliance of the court. To understand what happened to Elizabeth, we must understand the trajectory of the man she had married. Because she rose as he rose, her dignity and her fortune carried up on the strength of his advancement. Thomas Boleyn possessed exactly the gifts that the new Tudor court prized. He was intelligent, hard-working, and supremely capable, fluent in French and skilled in Latin, a master of the arts of diplomacy and the subtle craft of the courtier. He had the gift of making himself useful to the great, of being reliable and discreet and effective, and he attached himself to the rising fortunes of the young King Henry with all the skill at his command. He was employed on embassies abroad, sent to represent his king at the courts of Europe, trusted with delicate negotiations and high responsibilities, and he performed these tasks with a competence that won him steady advancement. Office and honour and reward came to him, year by year, as he proved his worth, and the Boleyn fortune and standing grew with each step he climbed. He moved, in his diplomatic career, through the great courts and councils of Europe, among the rulers and ministers who shaped the affairs of nations, and he brought back to England a knowledge of that wider world that few of his countrymen possessed. He had served at the court of the Archduchess Margaret in the Low Countries, that brilliant centre of culture and politics, and it was through his connections there that his girl Anne had first been placed abroad to be educated. He had been employed on missions to France and to the court of the Emperor, trusted with the delicate business of negotiation and alliance, present at great occasions of state where the fate of kingdoms was discussed. This was a man at home in the highest circles of European affairs, sophisticated, well-travelled, fluent in the languages and the manners of the continent, and his standing rested on real ability and real achievement, not merely on the favour that his daughters would later bring. She was married to one of the most accomplished public men of his generation, and his career carried the family into contact with the wider currents of the age, into the great world of European politics and culture, far beyond the green seclusion of Hever. The provincial gentry family was, through Thomas Boleyn's talents, woven into the affairs of nations, and Elizabeth's life, as his wife, was lifted into that larger sphere. His most famous embassy carried him to the heart of European affairs, and his diplomatic career placed him among the trusted servants of the crown, a man of real consequence in the government of the realm. He accumulated offices and lands and influence, became a figure to be reckoned with at court, and laid the foundation for the still greater elevation that was to come. And all of this raised Elizabeth too, of course, for the wife shared in the husband's dignity, and as Thomas Boleyn rose from gentleman to courtier to royal servant of high standing, his wife rose with him, her position growing grander, her household richer, her place at court more assured. The rewards of this steady climbing were visible in their whole manner of life, for as Thomas Boleyn rose, the Boleyns lived ever more grandly, their houses richer, their households larger, their style of life more magnificent. Money flowed in from offices and grants in the king's favour, and it was spent on the outward show that proclaimed a family's standing, the fine clothes and the rich furnishings, the plate and the tapestries and the trappings of consequence. Hever was improved and adorned. The Boleyns acquired other properties and a presence in London near the court, and the whole apparatus of their living grew to match their rising place. For Elizabeth, this meant a life of increasing splendour, larger households to command, finer things about her, a grander style befitting the wife of a great courtier. The material rise was real and tangible. the visible fruit of her husband's success, and she lived amid its growing comfort and magnificence, a great lady whose surroundings reflected her family's steady ascent toward the summit of the kingdom. It was a good life, by every external measure, a life of wealth and consequence and ease, and it grew steadily grander through the years of their climbing toward the height from which the fall, when it came, would be so very far. There is a particular quality to Thomas Boleyn's ambition that is worth naming, because it casts a long shadow over the family's story, and that is its coldness. He was not a man who rose by warmth or by the love of others. He rose by calculation, by relentless self-advancement, by a clear-eyed pursuit of his own interest that never seems to have been softened by much sentiment. He used what he had, including his children, as instruments of his advancement, and he would prove, in the terrible days to come, to be a man who valued his own survival above the lives of his own son and daughter. This was the partner with whom Elizabeth had built her life and her family, and we may wonder, though we have no way of knowing, whether she shared his cold ambition or merely endured it, whether the relentless climbing was a joint enterprise or a thing she watched with private misgiving. For there is a contrast that suggests itself between the cold father and what we may guess of the mother. Thomas Boleyn's coldness is well documented, his willingness to profit and to save himself a matter of record. Of Elizabeth's heart we know nothing directly, but it is hard not to imagine that a mother felt differently about the children who were being deployed as pieces in the great game, that where the father saw assets to be used, the mother saw sons and daughters to be loved and feared for. This is speculation, and I mark it as such, but it is speculation grounded in the ordinary difference between a calculating man and a mother's love, and it shapes the way we read the tragedy that followed, in which the father survived and prospered while the mother, we may believe, was broken by grief. The son. What is certain is that by the early 1520s they had arrived. They were no longer merely prosperous gentry. They were a house of real standing at the court of Henry VIII, established, connected, rising, with a brilliant and ambitious head and a brood of accomplished children, and a place near the centre of the kingdom's affairs. Elizabeth, the Howard girl who had married the climbing Boleyn, was now the wife of a leading courtier, mistress of a rising house, a noblewoman in the fullest sense. And they stood, though no one yet knew it, on the threshold of an ascent so steep and so dangerous that it would carry them to a height no one could have predicted, and then dash them down into a ruin no one could have imagined. The instrument of that ascent would be Elizabeth's own daughters, and the first of them to catch the king's eye was the eldest, Mary. The first of Elizabeth's children to be drawn into the king's orbit was her eldest daughter, Mary, and the way she was drawn in was the way that gave a family both advantage and shame, for Mary Boleyn became the mistress of Henry VIII. Sometime in the early 1520s, the king's wandering eye fell upon the elder Boleyn daughter, recently returned from the French court, and she became for a few years his lover, one in the succession of women who caught the fancy of a king not famous for his fidelity. And so Elizabeth found herself in the strange and difficult position of being the mother of a royal favourite, watching her own girl become the king's plaything, with all the mingled advantage and degradation that such a position carried. The position of a king's mistress was a strange and ambiguous one, and the moral world that surrounded it was full of contradiction. On the one hand, the taking of mistresses by kings was an accepted feature of court life, expected almost, a thing that everyone knew happened, and that carried a kind of tacit acceptance, particularly when the queen was occupied with childbearing or had ceased to attract her husband. A king's amours were not in themselves a great scandal, but a part of the ordinary working of a court. And yet, on the other hand, there clung to such a station an undeniable taint, a sense of the woman used and dishonoured, of virtue compromised for advantage, that no acceptance could quite dispel. Such a woman occupied a place of influence and danger, both courted for the favour she might win, and despised for the means by which she won it, elevated and degraded at once. For the kin of such a woman, the ambiguity was sharp, the advantage real, but the honour doubtful, and they had to navigate the strange territory of profiting from a daughter's dishonour while maintaining the appearance of respectability. Elizabeth, as the mother of a king's mistress, lived for a time in this ambiguous country, and whatever she made of it privately, she would have had to wear the complicated public face that such a position demanded. It was, in the calculus of the court, a thing of double meaning. To have a daughter in the king's bed brought a family favour and profit, for kings rewarded the families of the women they took up with offices and grants and advancement, and the Boleyns did indeed benefit from Mary's connection to the king. But it brought no honour, for a mistress was not a wife, and the position carried a tincture of shame, a sense of the daughter used and the kin complicit in her use. Mary was not made a lady of rank by her royal affair. She was used and then, in time, set aside, as royal mistresses were, and she slipped back into relative obscurity, but a brief moment of dangerous intimacy with the king leaving her, in the end, with little beyond the shadow on her name. What did Elizabeth make of it, watching her eldest daughter become the king's mistress? Here, as so often, we have no record of her feelings, and we are left to imagine. Perhaps there was a kind of pride, or at least satisfaction, in their calculating reckoning, for the connection brought benefits, and a house on the make did not despise the favour of a king. But it is hard to believe that a mother felt only satisfaction. To see a daughter used as a king's passing pleasure, with all the risk and degradation that involved, and then to see her discarded when the king's interest cooled, can hardly have been a simple joy. We may imagine, beneath whatever public face they wore, a more complicated maternal response, a mingling of advantage and unease, of profit and quiet shame. Mary's later story took a turn that set her apart from the rest of the family, and it is worth telling, because it bears on Elizabeth's own losses. After her time as the king's mistress had passed, Mary did something that scandalized her ambitious family. She married for love a man far beneath her in fortune and rank, a soldier of no great prospects, choosing affection over advancement in a way that the calculating Boleyns could not forgive. For this she was cast out, banished from the court, cut off by a family that saw her love match as a disgrace and an embarrassment at the very height of their glory. It was a harsh repudiation, the rejection of a daughter for the crime of marrying where her heart led rather than where her family's interest dictated. And we cannot know what Elizabeth, the mother, felt about this banishment of her eldest child, whether she shared the family's anger or grieved in private for the daughter sent away. But the irony of it would become clear soon enough, for it was precisely this disgrace, this banishment, that placed Mary far from the court and out of danger when the catastrophe struck, and so preserved her, the rejected daughter, as the only one of the 3 children to survive. The child the family had cast off was the child who lived. There is something to be said, too, about what Mary's experience meant as a kind of warning, a foreshadowing of what was to come. For in Mary's brief career as the king's mistress, and in her subsequent discarding, lay a lesson about the nature of royal favour, about how it could raise a woman up and then drop her, about the danger of building a family's fortunes on the shifting ground of a king's desire. She had seen it once already, in the rise and fall of the queen she had served, Catherine of Aragon, whose own security was even now beginning to crumble. And now she saw it in her own daughter, the king's affection given and then withdrawn. The pattern was there to be read, for anyone with eyes to see it, the perilous instability of a position that rested on nothing more solid than a king's pleasure. And yet they did not read the warning, or did not heed it, because the stakes were about to become far higher. Mary had been a mistress, a passing fancy, and her rise and fall had been a small thing, a matter of a few years and modest profit and modest shame. But the king's eye, having lit upon one Boleyn daughter, would soon light upon the other, and the second daughter would play the game very differently. Where Mary had yielded and been used and discarded, Anne would refuse and hold out and demand everything, and in demanding everything she would set in motion a transformation that would shake the foundations of the kingdom. The mistress had been the prelude. The Queen was about to make her entrance, and with her entrance the Boleyn fortunes and Elizabeth's own life would be carried up to a height that dwarfed anything that had gone before. For Elizabeth, the lesson of Mary, whatever she made of it, was soon overtaken by events. The quieter shame of a daughter who had been a mistress was about to be eclipsed by the dazzling, dangerous glory of a daughter who would be a queen. And the mother who had watched her eldest used and discarded would now watch her second girl reach for the crown of England itself, and would find herself, in consequence, lifted to a grandeur, and exposed to a peril that no mother should ever have to know. So let us turn now to Anne, the dark-eyed second daughter, returning from France to set the English court ablaze. When Anne Boleyn came home from France, somewhere in the middle of the 1520s, she came home transformed, and her return is one of the hinges of our story, for it brought into Elizabeth's world the daughter who would change everything. The girl who had been sent abroad as a child had grown into a woman unlike any the English court had seen, polished by years at the most sophisticated court in Europe into something dazzling, foreign, and new. She was not a conventional beauty by the standards of the day, but she had something far more dangerous than beauty, a brilliance, a wit, a style, a way of carrying herself that drew every eye and held it. She dressed with French elegance, spoke with French polish, sang and danced and conversed with an accomplishment that set her apart, and she radiated a kind of bold, sharp, electric charm that the court had never quite encountered before. For Elizabeth, the return of this transformed daughter must have been a complicated joy. Here was the child she had borne and given up to the wider world, come home a stranger and a marvel, made into something the mother could scarcely have imagined. There would have been pride in it, surely, to see her daughter so admired, so accomplished, so plainly destined to make a great marriage and a great place for herself. Anne was, in those first years after her return, the brightest ornament of her family, a young woman of evident brilliance, whose future seemed full of promise. A mother might look on such a daughter with deep satisfaction, seeing in her the flowering of everything the family had worked for. But the promise of Anne's future was about to take a turn that no one had planned, and that no one could control, for the king began to notice her. Henry VIII, who had already taken one Boleyn daughter as his mistress, now found his eye drawn to the other. And what began, perhaps, as another royal flirtation became, over the months and years that followed, something altogether more serious and more dangerous. For Anne would not be what her sister had been. She would not be a mistress used and discarded. She refused the king's advances, held herself back, declined to yield, and in declining she did something extraordinary. She made the king want her more, want her so badly that he began to contemplate the unthinkable, the setting aside of his queen and the making of Anne Boleyn into his wife. These were not swift events, but a long and grinding ordeal, stretching over years, and the strain of it must have told upon the whole family. For the king's pursuit of Anne, and her refusal to yield outside marriage, created a situation that dragged on, as Henry struggled to free himself from Catherine, and Anne waited in a strange suspended state, the king's beloved but not his wife, courted and elevated but not yet secure. It was a limbo that lasted the better part of a decade, a long season of waiting and uncertainty in which the Boleyn fortunes hung perpetually in the balance, neither risen nor fallen, suspended between triumph and disaster. The tension of such a wait, the years of not knowing whether the great gamble would succeed or fail, must have been exhausting and frightening, a prolonged ordeal of hope and dread. And through it all, Anne held her course, refusing to become a mere mistress, holding out for the crown, playing a long and dangerous game with extraordinary nerve. She watched her walk this perilous line without end, and must have lived in a state of perpetual suspense, the family's whole future riding on the outcome of a struggle that seemed as though it might never end. We must try to imagine how this looked from Elizabeth's vantage, as a mother watching the storm gather around her daughter. At first, perhaps, it seemed merely that the king was paying Anne attention, a flattering and dangerous thing, but familiar enough in a court where the king's favour was the great prize. But as the months passed and the king's passion deepened, as it became clear that this was no passing fancy, but a consuming obsession, as the talk began to circulate that the king might actually mean to make Anne his queen, the situation must have come to seem extraordinary and frightening in equal measure. Her daughter was the object of the king's overwhelming desire, and the king was a married man, married to the Queen Elizabeth had once served, and the thing that was being contemplated, the dissolution of a royal marriage, and the elevation of a Boleyn daughter to the throne, was so vast and so perilous that its consequences could scarcely be foreseen. Did Elizabeth rejoice, or did she fear? We cannot know, but the question presses upon us, because the situation held both glory and terror in equal and inseparable measure. The glory was almost beyond imagining that a daughter of hers might become Queen of England, that the blood of the Howards and the Boleyns might be raised to the throne itself. No family in the kingdom could have dreamed of a greater elevation. But the terror was there too, woven into the glory, for the path to that throne ran through the destruction of an existing queen, through the defiance of the Pope and the Church and the Emperor, through a confrontation with the deepest powers of the age, and through the dangerous, volatile, all-consuming desire of a king whose favour, as the family had already seen, could turn. To reach for the crown was to play for the highest stakes imaginable, and to risk, if the game went wrong, a fall as great as the rise. There is a peculiar danger in being the family whose daughter a king desires, and it is a danger the Boleyns may not fully have reckoned with in the heady early days of Anne's rise. To be raised by royal goodwill is to be made wholly dependent upon it, to have one's fortunes bound to the most capricious thing in the world, the heart of a king. The Boleyns had no independent power to match its sudden eminence, no army, no impregnable wealth, no base of strength that did not derive, in the end, from the king's goodwill. They rose because Henry desired Anne, and everything they gained, the titles and the offices and the influence, was the gift of his desire, held only so long as it endured. It made them great, but it made them fragile, for a power that rests entirely on another's goodwill can be withdrawn as easily as it was given, and the higher such a family climbs, the more completely it is at the mercy of the one whose favour raised it. The Boleyns climbed very high indeed, and in climbing they made themselves utterly dependent on a king whose desires, as they should have known, were not constant, and whose favour, once withdrawn, would leave them exposed and friendless at a dizzying height, surrounded by the enemies their rise had made, and lacking any strength of their own to break their fall. And so Elizabeth entered the most extraordinary phase of her life, the years in which her daughter was the centre of the kingdom's greatest drama, the years in which the family was carried up toward the very summit of power on the strength of a king's desire. It was a dizzying ascent, and it must have been lived in a state of perpetual tension, exhilaration and dread mingled together, as the Boleyns climbed higher and higher into a region where the air was thin and the ground was treacherous, and a single misstep meant ruin. She was no longer merely the wife of a rising courtier. She was the mother of the woman who would be queen, and her own elevation and her own peril rose with her daughters toward a height that would soon make her a countess, and, in time, would break her heart. As the king's passion for Anne grew and the Boleyn fortunes soared, the rewards came tumbling down upon the Boleyns, and chief among them was the elevation that made Elizabeth at last a countess. For the king, in his desire to honour the family of the woman he meant to marry, raised Thomas Boleyn higher and higher in the peerage. First he was made a viscount, and then, in the year 1529, he was created Earl of Wiltshire and Earl of Ormond, a double earldom that placed him among the senior nobility of the realm. And as his wife, Elizabeth, became the Countess of Wiltshire, a noblewoman of the highest rank, her grandeur now matching and even surpassing the dignity of her Howard birth. There is a satisfying symmetry in this when we remember where she had begun. She had been born a Howard, a daughter of the high nobility, and she had married, in the strict reckoning of rank, beneath herself, taking a husband of lesser blood. Now, decades later, that husband had climbed so far that she was raised to a countess in her own right, lifted by his ascent to a dignity as great as any she might have claimed by birth. The descent she had made in marrying a Boleyn had been reversed and more than reversed, and the great Howard heiress was now a great Boleyn countess, the wife of an earl, the mother of the king's beloved, standing near the very pinnacle of the kingdom. There is something worth understanding in the way Elizabeth's own dignity climbed and fell with her husband's, for it illuminates the position of women in that world. A woman of the nobility held her rank, in the main, through the men she was attached to, first her father and then her husband, and her own elevation followed theirs. She had been born to high station as a Howard girl, had descended somewhat in marrying a Boleyn, and now rose again to the rank of countess as her husband was raised to an earldom, her own title and dignity a reflection of his. She became the Countess of Wiltshire not by any act of her own, but because her husband was made an earl, her grandeur derivative of his, as a wife standing always was. This was the settled order of things, and Elizabeth would have thought it entirely natural, but it meant that her fortunes were bound inseparably to her husband's and her family's, that she climbed when they climbed, and would fall if they fell, that she had no independent standing of her own to fall back upon. When the catastrophe came and destroyed her children, Elizabeth's own position, so wholly dependent on the family's fortunes, was shaken with theirs, and the countess who had risen so high found that her height, like everything else about her, belonged not to her alone, but to the family whose fate she shared. It was the zenith of the family's fortunes, the bright summer of the Boleyn ascendancy, and we should pause to picture them in their glory, but before the shadows gathered, the whole family was riding high. Thomas Boleyn was an earl and a great officer of state, trusted and favoured, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. His son George was a rising courtier, charming and able, advancing in the king's service, soon to be a lord in his own right. His daughter Anne was the king's adored, the woman for whom Henry was preparing to remake his kingdom, soon to be Queen of England. And Elizabeth presided over it all as the Countess, the matriarch of a house that had climbed from merchant origins to the threshold of the throne in a few generations, a rise as dazzling as any in the history of the English nobility. Her son George rose alongside his sisters in these years, and he deserves a place in the picture of the Boleyns at their height, for he was the third of Elizabeth's surviving children, and the one who would die beside Anne in the end. George Boleyn was a young man of real brilliance, charming and clever, and accomplished, a poet and a wit, a favourite at court, advancing in the king's service as his family rose. He was given offices and honours, employed on embassies as his father had been, made a lord in his own right, a rising star of the court whose future seemed as bright as his sister's. He was by all accounts gifted and attractive, a young man of great promise, the male hope of the family, the son who would carry the Boleyn name forward into the next generation. For Elizabeth, he was her boy, her only son, the child in whom the line's continuance rested, and she must have watched his rise with a particular maternal pride, the more so as a son's success meant the carrying on of the line. That this same beloved son would be swept up in his sister's destruction, accused of the unspeakable, and put to death beside her, was a horror that lay still hidden in the future, in these years of their glory, when George shone at court as one of its brightest ornaments. For Elizabeth herself, this must have been a strange and heady time, the years of the family's greatest glory. She had spent her life rising, carried up step by her husband's relentless ambition, and now she had reached a height she could scarcely have imagined as a girl. She was a countess, a great lady at the centre of the court, the mother of the most talked-about woman in England. The deference that surrounded her, the splendour of her households, the consequence of her family, all of it had grown to a magnificence that crowned a lifetime of advancement. By every external measure, she had arrived, had achieved the summit of what a woman of her world could achieve, the highest place short of the throne itself. And yet we should not imagine that the glory was untroubled because the height they had reached was a precarious one, and the means by which they had reached it carried danger in its very nature. The Boleyns had risen on the strength of a king's desire, and a king's desire was the most unstable foundation imaginable, as Elizabeth, who had watched her own elder daughter used and discarded, knew better than most. The family's whole position depended on Anne, on the king's continuing passion for her, on the success of the enormous and dangerous enterprise of making her his queen. If the enterprise failed, if the king's passion cooled, if the great gamble went wrong, the house that had climbed so high could fall just as far. The glory was real, but it was built on sand, and somewhere beneath the splendour of these years, a watchful mother may have sensed the instability of it all. But for now the Boleyns rode high, and the bold gamble seemed to be succeeding, for the king was driving forward, with all the force of his will and his power, toward the goal of making Anne his wife. The obstacle was enormous, for Henry was already married to a queen who would not step aside, bound by a union that canon law held indissoluble. To clear that obstacle, the king was about to undertake the most momentous action of his reign, an action that would break England away from the Church of Rome and change the religious history of the world. And the Boleyns, Elizabeth among them, were at the very centre of it, the family whose daughter's marriage was the cause for which a king would remake his kingdom. So let us turn to that great matter, the breaking of a marriage and the breaking of a faith, and see how it looked from inside the family it raised so high. The thing that the king set in motion in order to marry Anne Boleyn was so vast that it changed the course of English history, and Elizabeth lived through it from the inside, as the mother of the woman at its centre. We call it the king's great matter, that long and bitter struggle to dissolve his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and it consumed years, divided the kingdom, and ended by tearing England away from the Church of Rome. It is one of the decisive turning points of European history, and the family at the heart of it was Elizabeth's own. The difficulty was this. Henry was married to Catherine of Aragon, and had been for many years, and the Church held that union to be valid and binding, and not to be dissolved. To marry Anne, Henry needed his marriage to Catherine annulled, declared null and void, and only the Pope could grant such an annulment, and he, for reasons of conscience and of politics, would not grant it, caught as he was between the king's demands and the power of Catherine's nephew, the Emperor, the mightiest ruler in Europe. For years the matter dragged on, the king pressing, the pope delaying, the lawyers and the theologians arguing, the whole machinery of crown and clergy grinding away at a problem that would not be solved. And all the while Anne waited, neither wife nor mistress, the king's beloved, but not yet his queen, in a strange and dangerous limbo that stretched on without resolution. For the Boleyns, these were years of enormous tension, for everything depended on the outcome. Their whole position, their wealth and their honours and their hopes rested on the king's success in freeing himself to marry Anne. If he succeeded, they would be raised beyond imagining the kin of the queen. If he failed, if the great matter collapsed, they would be left dangerously exposed, the house that had reached for the crown and missed, with all the enemies that their ambition had made, and none of the security that success would bring. The stakes could not have been higher, and the outcome hung in doubt for years, as the king battered against the immovable obstacle of the Pope's refusal. The struggle was not merely a domestic matter, but an affair that reached across all of Europe, entangling the great powers of the age, and the family lived at the centre of this vast web of politics. Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of the Emperor Charles V, the mightiest ruler in Christendom, and the Emperor would not see his kinswoman cast aside without resistance, so that the king's desire to be rid of her became a matter of high international politics, a quarrel that drew in the Pope and the Emperor and the King of France, and the whole tangled diplomacy of the continent. The Pope, caught between the King of England and the Emperor who held him half in thrall, dared not grant the annulment Henry demanded, and so the matter ground on, a deadlock of competing powers that no amount of argument could break. The Boleyns thus found themselves at the heart not only of an English crisis, but of a European one, their families' fortunes bound up with the great game of nations, the rise of their daughter, opposed by the most powerful forces in Christendom. It was a measure of how high they had climbed that their fate was now entangled with the affairs of emperors and popes, and a measure of how dangerous their position was that they had made enemies on such a scale, set against them the great Catholic powers of the age, in a struggle whose stakes were nothing less than the religious unity of Europe. And then Henry did the extraordinary thing. Unable to get his annulment from Rome, he broke with Rome altogether. In a series of momentous steps, he repudiated the authority of the Pope, declared himself supreme head of religion in his realm, severed the 1,000-year-old bond between realm and papacy, and took into his own hands the power to dissolve his marriage. It was a revolution, the greatest in English history, the breaking of the religious unity of the realm and the birth of a separate national faith, and it was done at bottom so that the king could marry Anne Boleyn. The daughter Elizabeth had borne and raised was the cause for which a king remade his kingdom and changed the faith of his people. We must try to grasp how staggering this was, and how it must have felt to be the mother at the centre of it. She had served Catherine of Aragon as a young woman, had attended the Queen who was now being cast aside. She had borne and raised the child for whose sake the casting aside was being done. She watched from her place within the family as the whole vast apparatus of the kingdom was turned to the purpose of freeing the king to marry her child, as the old church was broken, and the queen was humbled, and the world was turned upside down, all so that Anne might wear the crown. It was a thing without precedent. Her family's daughter made the pivot on which the history of a nation turned, and Elizabeth was there for all of it, the mother of the revolution. The great matter was not only a question of religion and state, but a human tragedy played out at the centre of the kingdom, and Elizabeth, who had been close to the principal sufferers, would have watched it with a particular and complicated awareness. For the breaking of the king's first marriage meant the breaking of Catherine of Aragon. The mistress Elizabeth had served, a proud and devout woman who fought to the end against the dissolution of her marriage and the bastardizing of her daughter, and who was cast out, separated from the child she loved and left to die in lonely exile. It meant the ruin, too, of that daughter, the Princess Mary, declared illegitimate, stripped of her place, bullied and humiliated, her whole world destroyed. These were people Elizabeth had served, the queen she had attended, and the princess born during her own years at court, and their suffering was the price of her own child's rise. There is a terrible entanglement in this, that the elevation of Anne required the destruction of Catherine and Mary, that Elizabeth's triumph as a mother was built upon another mother's catastrophe. Whether she felt the weight of that, whether she spared a thought of pity for the queen she had once served, it is impossible to say, but a thoughtful woman could hardly have been blind to the human cost of the thing that was raising her family so high. What she thought of it, whether she rejoiced in the triumph, or trembled at the danger, or grieved for the queen she had once served, we cannot tell. The religious dimension alone must have given a thoughtful woman pause, for the breaking with Rome was, to many, a fearful and sinful thing, the rending of the unity of Christendom, and there were those in Elizabeth's own family and class who regarded it with horror. Whether Elizabeth was a convinced reformer, glad to see the old church humbled, or a traditionalist troubled by the upheaval, we have no way of knowing. But she lived at the centre of it, the mother of the woman for whom it was done, and she could not have been untouched by the magnitude of what was unfolding around her. And at the end of that long struggle, when the king had broken the church and freed himself at last, the prize was claimed, and Anne, Elizabeth's daughter, was made Queen of England. And so the impossible thing came to pass, and Elizabeth Howard, the forgotten countess, became the mother of a Queen of England. In the year 1533, after the long years of struggle, Anne was married to the king and crowned his queen, and the daughter of the Howard and the merchant-born Boleyn was raised to the throne of England. It was an elevation so extraordinary that we must pause upon it and try to feel what it meant. For in the whole history of the English nobility, there are few rises to match it, and for the mother who had borne and raised the new queen, it must have been a moment beyond anything she could have dreamed. The coronation itself was a magnificent affair, a great state occasion designed to proclaim the new queen's legitimacy and grandeur to the kingdom and the world. Anne was carried through the streets of London in splendour, crowned in Westminster Abbey with all the ancient ritual of an English coronation, feasted and celebrated as the king's beloved made queen. It was the public triumph of their ascendancy, the moment when their long climb reached its dazzling summit, when the daughter of the house was set upon the throne itself. And though the city's welcome was famously cool, for the people loved Catherine and resented her supplanting, the thing itself was done, the crown was placed upon Anne's head, and Elizabeth's daughter was queen. There was, in this elevation, a crossing of the deepest line in that hierarchical world, the line between subject and sovereign, and it is hard for us now to feel how vast that crossing was. In the rigid order of rank that governed Elizabeth's age, the gulf between even the highest nobility and the royal family was an enormous one, a difference not merely of degree but almost of kind, for the monarch and the monarch's family stood on a level apart, touched with a sacred quality, set above the ordinary run of the great. For a woman of the nobility to cross that line, to become not merely a great lady but a crowned queen, the king's own wife, anointed and crowned, was to be lifted into a sphere that ordinary subjects could only gaze upon from below. And Elizabeth's daughter had made that crossing, had passed from the ranks of the king's subjects into the royal family itself, had become the sovereign's consort, sharing in the sacred aura of monarchy. The mother who watched it happen had born and raised a girl who was now a queen, had seen her own child cross the great line into royalty, and there could be no more extraordinary thing for a mother of the nobility to witness, the translation of her daughter from subject to sovereign, from the world of the ruled into the world of the rulers. Imagine being the mother at such a moment. She had carried this child in her body, had borne her in a Kentish manor house, had raised her and shaped her and sent her out into the world, and now she watched that same child crowned in England, anointed and enthroned, the first lady of the kingdom, the wife of the king. The small warm weight that had once lain against her shoulder in the cold before dawn was now a crowned and reigning sovereign. No mother in England, perhaps no mother in the history of the realm, had ever risen so high through a child. It was the fulfilment of every ambition the family had ever nursed beyond the wildest reckoning of what was possible, and Elizabeth stood at the heart of it, the mother of the Queen. And yet the triumph was shadowed from the start by the hostility that surrounded the new Queen, for Anne Boleyn was not loved by the people of England, and her coronation, for all its splendour, was met with a notable coolness. The common people had loved Catherine of Aragon, the wronged queen who had been cast aside, and they resented the woman who had supplanted her, regarding Anne as an interloper, a homewrecker, even a witch who had bewitched the king. The crowds that lined the streets for Anne's coronation procession were sullen rather than joyful, withholding the warmth that such occasions were meant to summon, and the bride rode through a city that did not want her. This hostility was the ground note beneath the whole of Anne's queenship, the resentment of a people who never accepted her, the hatred of all those who loved the old queen and the old religion, and saw in Anne the destroyer of both. Elizabeth, watching her daughter crowned amid this coldness, may have felt the chill of it, the sense that the family's triumph rested on a narrow and dangerous foundation, that they had reached the summit against the will of much of the kingdom, and that the very height of their elevation had made them the focus of a vast and patient enmity, waiting for its day. There is a particular dignity that came to her in this, for the mother of the Queen was a person of the highest consequence, and Elizabeth's position now was as grand as any woman's in the kingdom below her daughter. She was the Queen's mother, kin to the throne, the matriarch of the family that ruled in all but name, for in these years the Boleyns were at the height of their power, with their daughter on the throne, and their kinsman in high office, and their influence spread through the court. She had begun as a Howard daughter married to a climbing commoner, and she had ended as the mother of a queen, the head of her female line raised to the very summit of the kingdom. It was a vindication of the whole long enterprise of the family's rise, the topmost point of the dizzying arc. And yet, even in this moment of supreme triumph, the seeds of disaster were already present, for the very thing that had raised them so high was the thing that made its position so dangerous. Anne was queen, but she was queen by the king's desire and the king's will alone, against the wishes of much of the realm, against the judgment of the church she had helped to break, against the love the people bore the queen she had displaced. She was hated by many, resented by more, ringed by enemies who longed for her fall, and her hold on her place depended entirely on the king's continuing favour, and on her giving him the one thing he wanted above all, which was a son. The crown sat upon her head, but it sat uneasily, and the higher the family had climbed, the further they had to fall if the king's favour ever turned. But in the first flush of Anne's queenship, these dangers lay in the future, and they savoured the triumph. She was the mother of the Queen of England, and her daughter was carrying the king's child, and the hope of the whole enterprise, the prince who would secure the dynasty and crown their success, seemed close at hand. The future seemed to open before them in glory, the Boleyn blood established on the throne, the family raised forever into the first rank of the kingdom. It was the high noon of their fortunes, and Elizabeth stood in the full light of it. What came next would test whether the glory could be made to last, for the Queen must now do the thing that all of it depended on, and bear the king a son. In the autumn of the year of Anne's coronation, the Queen was delivered of her child, and the child was a girl. She was named Elizabeth, after, it may be, the Queen's own mother, and she would grow up to become the greatest monarch in English history, the Queen who would give her name to an age. But on the day of her birth, she was a disappointment, for the king had wanted a son, had broken a kingdom and remade a church and defied the powers of Europe in the expectation of a son, and what he was given was a daughter. And so the granddaughter who would one day be Elizabeth I came into the world under a shadow, the wrong sex, a letdown, the first crack in the great edifice of their hopes. There is a poignancy in this birth that only the centuries could reveal. For the disappointing girl child, the daughter who should have been a son would grow up to be the most magnificent monarch in the whole history of England. The infant princess named Elizabeth, born under a shadow of disappointment, would survive the destruction of her mother, the long uncertainty of her childhood, the dangers of a kingdom torn by religious strife, and would come at last to the throne and reign for nearly half a century as Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the queen of the great age that bears her name. She would defeat the might of Spain, preside over a golden flowering of English culture, and become the very symbol of the nation's greatness. And she carried in her veins the blood of her grandmother Elizabeth Howard, the forgotten countess who died when the princess was a small child and who could never have known what her granddaughter would become. The child born to disappoint a king became the glory of her line, and the grandmother who shared her name lay long forgotten, while the granddaughter's fame filled the world. It is among the strangest turns in this whole strange story that the truest immortality of Elizabeth Howard should run through the very grandchild whose birth was greeted as a failure. For Elizabeth Howard, though, the birth of this grandchild must have held a private joy whatever the public disappointment, for she was now a grandmother to a princess, and the child was healthy and strong, and there was every reason to hope that sons would follow. A first child who was a daughter was no disaster in itself, for the Queen was young and had proved she could bear a living child, and this expectation was that a prince would come in time. So the family swallowed its disappointment and looked to the future, and Elizabeth had the quiet pleasure, amid the grand affairs of state, of a new grandchild, a small princess in the cradle, the latest fruit of their astonishing rise. To understand why the lack of a son weighed so crushingly, we must understand the terror of a disputed succession that haunted the men of that age. England had been torn within living memory by long and bloody wars fought over the crown, the dynastic struggles that had set family against family and drenched the kingdom in blood for a generation. The Tudor kings were haunted by the fear that such chaos might return if the succession were ever in doubt, and a clear male heir was held to be the surest guarantee against it, the guarantee of a peaceful passing of the crown from father to son. A daughter was thought a frail vessel for such a purpose, for a queen regnant was a thing almost untried and widely doubted, and a woman on the throne was feared to mean a disputed succession, a foreign husband, or a return to the wars. This was why Henry craved a son with such desperate intensity, why he had broken a marriage and a church in pursuit of one, why the failure to produce one was, in his eyes, a catastrophe that justified the most extreme measures. Anne had been raised up to give him that son, and when she gave him a daughter and then failed to give him anything that lived, she had failed in the one essential task, and her failure was, in the brutal logic of the age, a kind of doom. The irony that the daughter she did bear would prove one of the greatest rulers England ever knew was hidden from them all, for they could not see the future, and in the present, a girl was a disappointment and a danger, not a triumph. But the son did not come, and that was the beginning of the end. For all the king's desperate hope, all the family's anxious expectation, Anne did not give Henry the living son that everything depended on. There were further pregnancies, but they ended in disappointment and loss, in miscarriage and stillbirth, the longed-for prince slipping away before he could be born. And with each failure, The Queen's position grew a little weaker, for her whole worth to the king, beyond his cooling passion, lay in her ability to give him a male heir, and as the months and years passed without one, the foundation on which she stood began to crumble. We must understand how much hung on this, because it was the hinge on which the whole tragedy turned. The king had moved heaven and earth to marry Anne, had remade his kingdom for her, in the expectation that she would give him the son that Catherine of Aragon had not. That son was the entire point, the justification for everything, the prize for which the great gamble had been made. And when Anne failed to produce him, when pregnancy after pregnancy ended in grief, the king's whole reckoning began to change. The passion that had driven him to such lengths began to fade, and as it faded, the question arose in his mind. The same question that had doomed Catherine, whether this marriage too was cursed, whether God was withholding the son as a sign of divine displeasure. The very logic that had raised Anne up was turning against her. For Elizabeth, watching from within the family, these must have been years of mounting dread, however she masked it. She had seen this pattern before, in the fate of Catherine of Aragon, the queen who failed to give the king a son and was set aside. She had seen royal favour given and withdrawn in the case of her own girl Mary, and now she watched her labour under the same terrible burden, the need to produce a son, and fail, and she must have known, with a mother's fear, what failure might mean. The crown that sat upon Anne's head was held in place only by the king's goodwill and the hope of an heir, and the favour was cooling and the heir would not come, and the ground beneath her daughter was beginning, slowly, to give way, and there were enemies waiting for that ground to fail. Anne had made many in her rise, the friends of the old queen, the defenders of the old religion, the great men who resented the upstart Boleyns and the influence they wielded, the whole party at court that longed to see the proud queen brought down. As long as the king's passion held and the hope of a son endured, these enemies could do nothing. But as the king's love cooled and the queen's failures mounted, they began to gather, to scheme, to wait their moment. The family that had risen so high had risen by making itself the focus of the kingdom's deepest divisions, and now, as its great protector's favour wavered, the enemies it had made began to close in. Elizabeth, the mother of the queen, who could only watch as the danger she may long have feared began, at last, to take shape and to move toward her children. By the early months of the year 1536, the ground beneath Anne Boleyn had grown dangerously unstable, and a watchful mother must have felt the tremors. The king's passion, that overwhelming desire that had remade a kingdom, had cooled into resentment and disappointment. Anne had not given him his son. She had borne a daughter and then lost the children who came after. And at the start of that fateful year she miscarried of a child that was said to have been a boy, a blow that seems to have convinced the king that this marriage, like his first, was cursed and barren. The hope that had sustained Anne's position was gone, and with it went the king's love. And the king's eye, as it had once wandered toward Anne herself, now wandered again, this time toward another woman, a quiet and gentle lady of the court named Jane Seymour, who was everything Anne was not, mild where Anne was sharp, yielding where Anne was proud. The pattern that had destroyed Catherine of Aragon was repeating itself, the king's desire moving on, a new woman rising as the old one fell, and Anne now stood where Catherine had stood, the wife the king wished to be rid of, the obstacle to his desire. She had supplanted a queen, and now she was to be supplanted in her turn, and the wheel that had carried her up was carrying her down. And there is something especially cruel in the situation of a mother in such a case, who can see disaster approaching her child, and is yet entirely powerless to avert it. A mother's deepest instinct is to protect her children, to shield them from harm, to interpose herself between them and danger, and Elizabeth could do none of these things. She could not command the king's heart, could not silence the queen's enemies. could not alter the deadly logic that was closing around her daughter and her son. She was a great lady, but greatness gave her no power here, for the forces gathering against her children were beyond the reach of any private person. Driven by the king's will and the schemes of the mighty and the vast impersonal machinery of the Tudor state, all she could do was watch and dread and perhaps pray, as the danger mounted and the storm gathered and her children moved, all unknowing or unable to escape, toward the catastrophe that awaited them. There can be few torments greater than this, to foresee the ruin of one's children and to be helpless to prevent it. And if Elizabeth saw what was coming, as a watchful woman who knew the court might well have done, then the months before the catastrophe must have been a slow agony of helpless apprehension, the worst kind of suffering a mother can know. And the king's turning did not happen in a vacuum, for around the failing queen her enemies were stirring at last. Anne had made many in her rise, and they had waited, biding their time through the years when the king's passion made her untouchable. Now, with that passion visibly cooling, the watchers began to move. There were the friends of the old queen and the old religion, who had never forgiven Anne for the breaking of the church. There were the great men of the court who resented the Boleyn influence and longed to see it broken. And there was a rival faction gathering about the gentle Seymour woman, eager to advance their own candidate into the place Anne was vacating. For a mother who understood the court, the sight of these forces assembling must have been chilling, for she knew that a queen without the king's love and without a son was a queen with no defence, and that the enemies now circling were not the kind to be content with a mere setting aside. Something colder than divorce was taking shape, and Elizabeth, watching, could do nothing to arrest it. The woman the king now favoured, Jane Seymour, was in many ways the opposite of Anne, and the contrast tells us something about what had gone wrong. Where Anne was dark and brilliant and sharp-tongued, bold and provocative and quick, Jane was fair and quiet and mild, gentle and submissive and undemanding, a soothing presence after the storms of Anne's queenship. The king, aging and disappointed and weary of the conflict that surrounded his second marriage, was drawn to this calm and yielding woman as a man might be drawn to rest after a long battle, and Jane's very meekness was her appeal, the promise of peace after strife. The Boleyns, the rise of Jane Seymour was a mortal threat, for it meant that the king's heart had moved on, that Anne was no longer the object of his desire but an obstacle to it, that their whole position was now in deadly peril. And there was nothing they could do, for one cannot command a king's heart back to a woman it has left, cannot make him love again where love has died. Elizabeth, watching the king turn toward the gentle Seymour woman, would have understood that her daughter's hold on her place was failing, and that the failing of it might mean not merely disgrace but destruction, for a discarded queen was a dangerous thing, and the king had shown in the breaking of Catherine how ruthlessly he could deal with a wife who stood in his way. And it would go further than the setting aside of a queen, because Anne's enemies had been waiting for this moment, and they meant to make the most of it. To simply divorce Anne, as he had divorced Catherine, would have been difficult and dangerous, for it would have raised awkward questions and left Anne alive to be a focus of discontent. Her enemies, and perhaps the king himself, wanted something more final, something that would remove her completely and permanently, and clear the way for the king's new marriage without complication. And so there began to take shape, in the spring of that year, a plot of breathtaking ruthlessness, a scheme to destroy the queen not by divorce but by death, to bring against her charges so grave that she would be not merely set aside but executed, swept entirely out of the king's path. The charges, when they came, were monstrous and almost certainly false. Anne was accused of adultery, of betraying the king with a number of men of the court, and worse, of incest with her own brother George, and of conspiring the king's death. These were capital charges, treason charges, and they were brought against her with a speed and a determination that revealed the hand of powerful enemies and a king who wished to be free. The evidence was thin to the point of non-existence. The accusations wildly implausible. The whole proceeding a judicial murder dressed in the forms of law. But the king willed it, and the machinery of the state moved to accomplish it, and the queen who had risen so high was suddenly, in a matter of weeks, facing destruction. And the horror of it, for Elizabeth, was doubled, because the charges did not fall upon Anne alone. Among the men accused of adultery with the Queen was her own brother, George, Elizabeth's son, charged with the unspeakable crime of incest with his sister. In a single stroke, the plot reached for two of Elizabeth's 3 children, the daughter who was Queen and the son who was her brother, both swept up in the same monstrous accusation, both facing the same capital charge. The mother who had borne and raised them, who had watched them climb to the summit of the kingdom, was now to watch them dragged together toward the scaffold, accused of crimes against each other and against the king in a catastrophe that would take, in a matter of days, 2 of her own at once. The storm she had perhaps long feared had broken at last, and it had broken upon her family with a violence beyond anything she could have imagined. The destruction of Anne Boleyn and her brother was accomplished with terrible speed in the space of a few weeks in the spring of 1536, and these were the weeks in which Elizabeth's world collapsed. We must follow them, though it is painful to do so, because they are the heart of her tragedy, the time in which a mother lost 2 children to the executioner and could do nothing but watch. It began in the early days of May, when the arrests came. The men accused with the Queen were taken first, seized and carried to the Tower of London, and then Anne herself was arrested, taken from her apartments and conveyed by barge to the Tower, the great fortress on the river that was both palace and prison, where she was lodged in the very rooms she had occupied before her coronation, brought back in disgrace to the place of her triumph. And George, Elizabeth's son, was arrested too, taken to the Tower to face the charge of incest with his sister, the 2 of them imprisoned in the same fortress, awaiting the same fate. In a matter of days, the Queen and her brother, 2 of Elizabeth's children, were prisoners in the Tower, charged with crimes that carried death. The speed of it was a part of the horror, for the whole catastrophe unfolded in a matter of weeks, almost too fast to comprehend. One moment the Boleyns stood at the summit of the kingdom, the Queen secure, as it seemed, upon her throne, the brother high in the king's service, the whole edifice of Boleyn greatness apparently solid. And then, in the space of days, it all came down, the arrests following one upon another, the accused swept into the Tower, the charges laid, the machinery of destruction moving with terrible efficiency. There was no time to mount a defence, no time to rally support, no time even fully to grasp what was happening before it had happened. The men accused alongside the Queen, courtiers and gentlemen of the king's circle, were taken and tried and condemned with the same dreadful haste, their fates bound up with hers, swept away in the same storm. It was a demonstration of the absolute and terrifying power of the Tudor state, of how swiftly and completely the king's will, once turned to destruction, could annihilate even the greatest, and Elizabeth watched it fall upon her own children with a speed that must have left her reeling, the whole world of her family's glory collapsing almost overnight into ruin and death. The trials, when they came, were a foregone conclusion, for the king had willed the outcome and the court would deliver it. The accused men were tried and condemned. Anne and George were tried together, before a court of their peers, presided over, in a final cruelty, by their own great uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, Elizabeth's brother, the head of the Howard family. There is something almost unbearable in that detail, that the Queen and her brother were judged and condemned by their mother's own kin, that the great Howard family, to protect itself, sat in judgment on the Boleyn children it had helped to raise. The verdict was guilty, the sentence death, and the Queen of England and her brother were condemned to die on charges that few then or since have believed to be true. Behind the destruction of the Queen and her brother lay the cold hand of the King's chief minister and the colder will of the King himself, and it is worth naming the forces that ground Elizabeth's children to death. The whole proceeding was driven from the top, willed by a king who had decided to be rid of his wife, and executed by ministers who knew their master's mind and moved to accomplish it. The charges were assembled, the witnesses found or invented, the trials arranged, the verdicts assured, the entire apparatus of justice bent to produce a predetermined end. It was not justice, but the form of justice used as a weapon. The machinery of the law turned to the purpose of murder, and it worked with terrible smoothness. For when a king of that age willed a thing, the whole power of the state moved to bring it about. There was no appeal against such a will, no court that would overturn it, no power in the kingdom that could stand against it. Elizabeth's children were caught in this machinery, and it processed them toward death with the impersonal efficiency of a great engine, indifferent to their innocence, deaf to any plea, driven by a will that had decided they must die. And the mother could only stand outside it, watching the engine turn, knowing that nothing she or anyone could do would stop it or slow it or turn it from its course. Where was Elizabeth in these days, and what was she enduring? The records do not tell us, and that silence is itself a kind of mercy and a kind of cruelty, for we cannot follow her into her private agony, but neither can we know how she bore it. We know only that she lived, that she was somewhere, mother to a condemned queen and a condemned son, living through the days of their imprisonment and trial and the approach of their execution. We can only imagine the anguish of it, the helplessness, the horror of knowing that two of her children sat in the tower awaiting death, and that nothing she could do would save them. No appeal, no intercession, no mother's plea could move the king or halt the machinery that was grinding her children toward the scaffold. She could only wait, in whatever private hell those days were for her, for the news that they were dead. There is a particular cruelty in the situation that we should name, which is that Elizabeth's family, the Howards, and her husband, Thomas Boleyn, did not fall with Anne and George. The Duke of Norfolk presided over the trial and survived. Thomas Boleyn, the father, kept his head down, did nothing to defend his children, and survived too, retaining much of his position even as his son and daughter were destroyed. The men of the family preserved themselves, bent before the storm, let the children be sacrificed and lived on, and so Elizabeth was left in the dreadful position of belonging to a family that was, in part, complicit in the destruction of her own, surrounded by kinsmen who had chosen survival over loyalty, a mother whose children were being killed while the men around her saved themselves. And so events moved toward their terrible conclusion. George was to die first, and then Anne, the brother, and then the sister, executed within 2 days of each other in the precincts of the Tower. The whole monstrous business, from the first arrests to the final executions, occupied less than 3 weeks, a span in which a queen and a courtier were transformed from the height of fortune to condemned criminals awaiting death. For Elizabeth, that time must have been the longest and most agonizing of her life, the slow, unbearable approach of a double bereavement, the knowledge that her son and her daughter were to be killed, and that she was powerless to prevent it. The summit of her family's glory had become, in a matter of days, the scene of its destruction, and the mother who had risen so high through her children was now to lose them in the cruelest way imaginable. George Boleyn was beheaded first, on a scaffold on Tower Hill, put to death with the other condemned men, dying as a traitor, though he was almost certainly guilty of nothing but being his sister's brother in a family that had made too many enemies. And then, soon after, Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, was beheaded within the walls of the Tower, her sentence carried out by a swordsman brought specially from France, dying with a composure that impressed even her enemies. In the space of that week, Elizabeth Howard lost 2 of her 3 children, her son and her daughter, both put to death by the state, both swept away in the same catastrophe. There is no way to soften this, and I will not try. A mother lost 2 children to the executioner in a single week, and the bare fact of it is as terrible as anything in this whole terrible age. We do not know whether Elizabeth was near, whether she had any chance to see her children before the end, whether any word passed between them. The records are silent, and we are left with the unbearable bareness of the facts. Her queen and her son the courtier were executed, and she survived them, and that is nearly all we can say with certainty. The inner experience of those days, the grief of that mother, is lost to us, hidden behind the silence that swallowed so much of her life. But we do not need the details to feel the weight of it. To lose one child is among the heaviest sorrows a human being can bear. To lose 2 in a single week, to the public horror of execution on charges of monstrous crimes, is a sorrow almost beyond comprehension. Let us sit for a moment with the sheer scale of what happened to her, because it deserves to be felt and not hurried past. Elizabeth Howard had borne her children in hope and raised them in love, had watched them grow into accomplished and brilliant people, had seen them rise, through fortune and ambition, to the very summit of the kingdom. Her daughter a queen and her son a great courtier. It was a rise without parallel, a glory beyond any reasonable hope. And then in a matter of days it was all torn down, and the 2 children who had climbed so high were killed, branded as traitors and worse, their bodies buried without ceremony within the Tower, their names made by words for scandal and shame. The mother who had given them life outlived them both, and had to go on living in a world in which her children had been publicly destroyed. Consider, too, the peculiar cruelty of the charges under which they died, for it was not enough that they were killed. Their names were also poisoned. Anne was condemned as an adulteress and worse, branded with crimes of the foulest kind, her reputation deliberately destroyed so that her death might seem a justice rather than a murder. George was condemned for the unspeakable crime of incest with his own sister, an accusation designed to make the siblings monstrous in the eyes of the world. These charges were almost certainly fabrications, the inventions of a state determined to be rid of the Queen and to justify the deed, but they attached themselves to the dead and clung to their memory for centuries, and so Elizabeth could not even grieve her children as innocents wronged, could not mourn them openly as the victims of a judicial murder, for the official truth was that they had been guilty of vile crimes and had justly died. She had to carry her sorrow in the knowledge that her children's names were bywords for scandal, that the world believed, or professed to believe, the worst of them, that the memory of her son and daughter was draped in shame. To lose a child is terrible. To lose a child whose name has been deliberately blackened, whose memory you cannot even defend, is a refinement of cruelty that few bereaved mothers have ever had to bear. There is a sorrow that has no remedy and no consolation, and this was such a one. The ordinary supports that a bereaved parent might cling to were denied her. She could not even mourn her children honourably, for they had died as condemned traitors, their memory blackened, their names dragged through the foulest accusations. She could not protest their innocence, for to do so was dangerous in a kingdom where the king had willed their deaths. Nor could she share her sorrow openly with those around her, in a family and a court where her children's names had become things of shame. She was left alone in the wreckage of her family, with an anguish she could not even fully express, and the world that had courted them in their glory now turned away. The Boleyns had been the focus of the kingdom's attention in their rise, the kin of the Queen, courted and flattered and feared. Now they were the kin of a disgraced and executed queen, tainted by association, dangerous to know. The fair-weather friends fell away, the flatterers vanished. The family that had stood at the centre of the court was suddenly a thing to be shunned. Elizabeth, who had been the mother of the Queen, was now the mother of an executed traitor, and the splendour that had surrounded her dissolved into shame and isolation. The whole edifice of their glory had collapsed, and she stood in the ruins of it, a mother bereaved of 2 children, and stripped of everything that had made her great. It is at this point, perhaps, that we feel most keenly the cruelty of her story, and the injustice of her being forgotten. For if ever a life deserved to be remembered with pity, it is this one, the life of a woman who rose to the heights through her children, and then watched those children destroyed, who tasted the greatest glory a mother could know, and then drank the bitterest grief, and who has been allowed to fade from memory as though she had never suffered at all. The famous faces of her children are everywhere in our histories. The face of the mother who bore them and buried them is nowhere, and so we owe it to her, I think, to dwell for a moment on what she endured, to acknowledge the magnitude of her loss, before we follow her into the silence of the years that remained to her. After the catastrophe, Elizabeth lived on, and the living on is its own kind of story, quieter than the great drama that had gone before, but in its way no less affecting. For she did not die of her grief, however much it must have felt in those first days as though she might. She survived the destruction of her children, and she went on into a world utterly changed, a world in which the family's glory was gone, and its name was shamed and its future was broken. She withdrew, it seems, from the court that had been the scene of so much triumph and so much ruin, and retreated into a quieter existence, into the shadows, into the long aftermath of catastrophe. We may imagine her returning to Hever, the old family seat in the green Kentish countryside, the house where her children had grown, and living out her remaining time there in the company of her memories. There is a terrible poignancy in the thought of it, the mother alone in the house where her children had once been young, surrounded by the rooms and the gardens and the country that had been the setting of their childhood, before the wider world drew them out to glory and to death. Every corner of such a place would have held a memory, every familiar view a reminder of the children who were gone. To live on in the home where they had been small, after they had been grown and great and destroyed, must have been a strange and haunted existence, the past pressing close on every side. And what of the marriage itself in these last years? It endured, in name, for Thomas Boleyn outlived the catastrophe, but whatever had bound the two of them through the long decades of their rise must have curdled into something cold and silent after the deaths of their children. They were 2 people who had built a vast enterprise together and seen it annihilated, and there can have been little left to say between them, little comfort to give or take. Nor did the husband long outlast the wife, for Thomas Boleyn himself died only a year or so after Elizabeth, his glory spent, his heirs gone, the long climb that had been his life's work ending in a diminished and lonely old age. The partnership that had begun with such ambition at the turn of the century, that had reached so dazzling a height, came to its end in this quiet exhaustion, the 2 architects of the family's fortunes dying within a year of one another in the wreckage of everything they had built. The family that had been so mighty was now a scattered and broken remnant, and its very fewness must have weighed on Elizabeth in those years. Of the 3 children she had raised, 2 were dead, and the 3rd estranged and far away. The brilliant household of the family's glory days, the great connected clan at the centre of the court, had dissolved into a handful of damaged survivors clinging on in the wreckage. Thomas Boleyn, stripped of the son and daughter who had been the source of his greatness, lived on for a few years more, a diminished figure, his glory gone, dying himself not long after his wife. The grandchildren were few and their futures clouded, The little Princess Elizabeth, now declared illegitimate like her elder half-sister, her place uncertain, her mother's memory a stain upon her. The whole great edifice that the family had built, the marriages and alliances and honours, the climb from merchant origins to the steps of the throne, had collapsed into this sad and meagre remnant, a few survivors scattered and diminished, the name that had blazed so brightly now, a thing of shame and sorrow. Elizabeth, who had seen the Boleyns at their dazzling height, lived to see it reduced to this, and the contrast between what had been and what remained must have been one of the bitterest elements of her grief. And there was Mary, the one child who remained to her. We have already seen how the eldest had been cast out years before, and how that very disgrace had carried her far from the court, and so spared her when the storm broke. Now she was all that was left, the sole survivor of the three, and we are left to wonder what passed between the bereaved mother and her one living child in these final years. Did they draw together in their shared loss, the two women who had outlived Anne and George, or had the old breach never healed? The records do not say. We know only that somewhere beyond the wreckage Mary lived on, married to her unfashionable husband, raising her own children in a quiet obscurity that must have seemed, after everything, a kind of mercy. Whether Elizabeth found any comfort in that surviving thread of her family, any solace in the child she had perhaps once helped to cast off, we cannot know, but it is gentle to hope that she did, that the mother and the daughter who both remained were not at the very last entirely alone. And the age she survived into was itself being transformed, for the religious revolution that her daughter had helped to set in motion was now gathering its full and terrible momentum. In the very years of Elizabeth's grief, the king and his ministers were dissolving the monasteries, the great religious houses that had stood for centuries, seizing their wealth and lands, turning their monks and nuns out of doors, demolishing or selling off the ancient foundations of English religious life. The faith in which Elizabeth had been raised, the old Catholic order of her girlhood, was being dismantled around her, the familiar landmarks of devotion swept away, the whole settled order of religious life overturned. She had been born into one age and was dying in another, and the change had come about in its first cause through her own daughter, through the king's desire to marry Anne. There is a vast and sombre irony in this, that the mother who had been formed in the old faith should live to see it broken, and broken in part because of the child she had borne. Whatever she made of the religious upheaval, whether she welcomed it or mourned it, she lived out her last years amid the wreckage of the old order, which her own family had done so much to bring down. What sustained Elizabeth through these years, what she thought and felt, how she filled her days, all of this is lost to us, swallowed by the silence that covers so much of her life. We know only that she went on, that she lived on in the aftermath, a bereaved mother in a broken family, the glory gone and the children dead, and the future emptied of hope. She had reached the summit of what a woman of her world could reach, the mother of a queen, and she had then descended into one of the deepest pits of sorrow that a mother could know, and now she lived in the flat grey country beyond catastrophe, the country of grief and survival and waiting, where there was nothing left to hope for, and nothing to do but go on until the end. It is worth saying that this surviving, this going on after the worst has happened, is itself a kind of quiet heroism, though it is not the kind that history celebrates. There is a courage in simply continuing to live when life has been emptied of its meaning, in rising each morning into a world that has taken everything, in bearing the unbearable, because there is no alternative but to bear it. She did this for nearly 2 years in the shadow of her children's deaths. She bore her grief in silence, as she had borne so much of her life in silence, and she carried it to the end. And the end, when it came, was not long in coming, for she did not long survive the catastrophe that had destroyed her children. The mother followed her children into death within 2 years, and we turn now to her quiet and unrecorded passing. The last years of Elizabeth's life were lived in the deep shadow of her loss, and though we know little of their detail, we can feel the shape of them, the slow fading of a woman who had outlived her own happiness. She was no longer young by the reckoning of her age when the catastrophe struck, a woman who had passed through her childbearing years and into the later seasons of life, and the blow of her children's deaths fell upon her at a time when she had less strength to absorb it. Grief is a heavy burden at any age, and heaviest of all, perhaps, in the later years, when the resilience of youth is gone and the future holds little to set against the sorrow. We may imagine that her health declined in these final years, worn down by grief, for there is a connection, recognized in every age, between sorrow of the heart and sickness of the body, and a mother who had suffered as Elizabeth suffered might well have found her strength failing under the weight of it. The records suggest that her last years were marked by ill health, that she was unwell in the time before her death, and it is not hard to imagine that the catastrophe of 1536 hastened her end, that the loss of her children took from her not only her happiness, but her will and her strength to live. She had endured the worst that life could do to a mother, and the enduring of it had cost her, and what remained of her life was lived in the diminishment that follows such a blow. The world, by now, had largely forgotten her, or wished to. The Boleyns were a fallen family, a name associated with scandal and disgrace, and there was little appetite at court or in the country to remember the mother of the executed queen. The crowds that had cheered, or failed to cheer, at Anne's coronation had moved on to other spectacles. The king had married again, and again after that, working his way through wives, while the woman who had been the mother of his second queen faded into obscurity. The great affairs of the kingdom rolled on, the Reformation deepening, the monasteries falling, the religious revolution that Anne had helped to begin gathering its terrible momentum, and amid all this great noise the quiet grief of one bereaved mother counted for nothing, was noticed by no one, left no mark. We may wonder, too, whether there was anyone left to comfort her, any companion of her grief in those last years. Her 2 famous children were dead, her eldest daughter long estranged and far away, her husband, a man who had saved himself, and could hardly have been a tender comfort in sorrow. Her own Howard kin had been complicit in the destruction of her children, her brother the Duke having presided over their condemnation, so that the family of her birth was stained, for her with the blood of her own offspring. She may have had attendants, waiting women, the servants who surround a great lady even in her decline, but of intimate comfort, of a heart to share her grief, the record gives us no sign, and we are left to imagine her largely alone, a bereaved mother in a house of memories, surrounded perhaps by people, but companioned by no one who could truly share the weight of what she carried. It is one of the loneliest pictures in this whole story, the old countess in her last years, her children dead, her family tainted, her glory gone, living out her time in a solitude of the heart that no attendance could relieve, waiting quietly for the end that would reunite her, if the faith she was raised in spoke true with the children she had lost. There is a particular loneliness in being forgotten while still alive, in outliving one's own significance, and Elizabeth must have known it in these last years. She had been, for a brief dazzling time, a person of the highest consequence, the mother of the Queen, courted and honoured at the centre of the kingdom's life. And now she was nothing, a relic of a fallen family, a woman whose moment had passed, and whose tragedy the world preferred to forget. The attention that had once surrounded her had vanished as completely as the glory, and she lived out her final time in a stillness that was the opposite of the brilliance she had once enjoyed, an obscurity all the deeper for the height from which she had fallen. And yet there is a dignity in this ending too. a dignity that the noise of her family's rise and fall had perhaps obscured. She had been through all of it, through the rise and the glory and the catastrophe, a woman who bore her part in silence, who left no record of complaint or boast or self-justification, who simply lived her life and met her fate. In her last years, stripped of everything, forgotten by the world, she remained what she had always been, a woman enduring with steady patience the things that came to her. There is a kind of strength in that endurance, the strength of the Howard blood, perhaps the tenacity of the father who had clawed his way back from disgrace. She had it, that quiet strength, and it carried her through to the end. The end came in the early spring of the year, 1538, less than 2 years after the loss of her children. She had not outlived them by much, as though the thread that bound her to life had been cut in some essential way by their loss, and she lingered only a little while in the world that had taken them. We have no record of the manner of her death, whether it was sudden or slow, peaceful or hard, but we know its season, the spring of that year, and we know that it brought to a close a life that had run from the high nobility of her birth, through the dazzling ascent of her family, to the catastrophe of her children's deaths, and out into the quiet of her final grief. She died and was buried, and the burial itself tells us something about who she was and where, in the end, she belonged. Elizabeth Howard died in the early days of April, in the year 1538, and she was buried not with the Boleyns but with the Howards in the Howard Chapel at the Church of Lambeth, across the river from Westminster, among the house into which she had been born. There is something quietly telling in that at the last she was laid among her own blood, the proud family whose name she had carried before ever she became a Boleyn. In death she came back to the Howards, to the ancient and mighty house that had given her beginning, as though the long detour of her Boleyn marriage, with all its glory and all its grief, had ended where it began, in the bosom of the family she was born to. Her burial was, by the standards of her former greatness, a modest affair. There was no grand state funeral for the mother of the executed queen, no grand public mourning, no monument to proclaim her consequence to the ages. She was buried quietly, as befitted a woman whose family had fallen from favour, laid to rest among her Howard kin without the splendour that had once surrounded her. And in a way this modesty is fitting, for it matches the quietness of her whole life, the way she had moved through the vast events of her age almost unseen, present but unregarded, leaving scarcely a trace. She had lived in the shadows of her famous children, and she was buried in the shadows too, without ceremony, without fame, a noble woman laid quietly to rest. It is worth pausing on the contrast between her end and the ends of her children, for it illuminates the strange shape of her fate. Her daughter Anne had died on a scaffold within the Tower, the most famous execution in English history, watched by the court, recorded in detail, remembered forever. Her son George had died on Tower Hill, a public spectacle, his end a matter of record. Their deaths were dramatic, terrible, and unforgettable, the stuff of history and legend. And then their mother, who had outlived them by less than 2 years, slipped away in quiet obscurity, her death unremarked, her burial modest, her going leaving barely a ripple. The children blazed and were extinguished in a great public fire. The mother simply, quietly went out, like a candle in an empty room. We do not even know with full certainty the details of where exactly she lies, for the church at Lambeth where she was buried has seen the passage of centuries, and the precise location of her grave, like so much else about her, has grown uncertain with time. The Howard Chapel, the family resting place, received her, but the exact spot, the monument if there was one, the marker of her grave, all of this has faded into the same obscurity that swallowed her life. She lies somewhere among the Howards, the mother of a queen, the grandmother of the greatest queen England would ever know, and we cannot point with confidence to the place. Even in death she eludes us, slips from our grasp, remains the shadowy figure she was in life. And yet, though her grave is uncertain and her memory faint, she left behind her something that would endure beyond any monument. The small, slighted infant whose christening had disappointed a king, the granddaughter who bore her name, would outlive every catastrophe of those years and rise, against all the odds of her dangerous childhood, to wear the crown of England. It is a thought worth holding as we stand at the quiet grave at Lambeth, that the forgotten woman lying there was grandmother to the most celebrated monarch the nation would ever know, and that the blood of the obscure countess ran, all unregarded, in the veins of a queen whose fame would fill the world. And the legacy ran on, in ways that Elizabeth could never have foreseen, far beyond the reign of her granddaughter. For through the blood she passed to her descendants, Elizabeth Howard was woven into the long fabric of English history in a manner that her quiet life and modest grave give no hint of. Her granddaughter, the Queen, would die childless, the last of the Tudors, and the crown would pass to other lines, but the wider kindred that Elizabeth belonged to, the Howards and the Boleyns and the families they married into, would continue to play their part in the unfolding story of the nation for generations to come. The Howard family, into which she was born, and among whom she was buried, would endure as one of the great houses of England down through the centuries, surviving every turn of fortune, present at the heart of English affairs, age after age. She was a link in this lengthy chain, a carrier of blood and connection that ran backward into the medieval past and forward into ages she could not imagine. A single woman standing at one point in a vast genealogical river that flowed on far beyond her own death. Her individual life was brief and ended in grief, but the line she belonged to ran on, and something of her, some thread of inheritance, was carried forward into the making of the nation that came after. So Elizabeth Howard passed from the world, quietly, in the spring of 1538, and was laid among her own, and was forgotten. But she had given the world her children, for good and for ill, and she had given the world, through them, a turning point in its history, and a queen for the ages. The woman herself vanished into silence, but her blood and her legacy ran on, shaping the future in ways she could never have foreseen. And that perhaps is reason enough to have spent this evening with her, to have called her back for a few hours from the obscurity that has covered her for so many years. For she deserves to be remembered, this mother of queens, and in remembering her we do a small justice to a life that history has too long overlooked. What then are we to make of Elizabeth Howard, now that we have followed her life from its high beginning to its quiet end? How should we remember this woman who has been so thoroughly forgotten, and what does her story rightly seen have to tell us? For we have travelled a long way with her this evening, from the cold before dawn at Hever to the modest grave at Lambeth, and it is worth gathering up at the last what that journey has shown us. The first thing to say is that hers was a life of extraordinary range, a life that touched the very heights and the very depths of human experience. Few people in any age rise so high or fall so far. She was born to greatness, married into ambition, and raised by her children's fortunes to the summit of the kingdom, the mother of a queen, kin to the throne, as exalted as a woman of her world could be. And then she was cast down into a grief as deep as her glory had been high, bereaved of 2 children in a single week, stripped of everything, left to mourn in obscurity. The arc of her life ran from one extreme to the other, from the dazzling height of her family's triumph to the abyss of its destruction, and she lived through all of it, the whole vast range of fortune, the wheel turning full circle from the top to the bottom. The second thing to say is that she was, above all, a mother, and that it is as a mother that her story has its deepest power. Everything that happened to her, the rise and the fall alike, came to her through her children. She rose because they rose, and she fell because they fell, and her fate was bound to theirs as a mother's fate is bound to her children's. And the central fact of her life, the thing that defines her, is that she gave life to children who changed the world and then were destroyed by it, that she watched her own offspring climb to glory and then saw them killed, and that she had to go on living afterward in a world that held their memory in scandal and shame. There is no more terrible thing that can happen to a mother than to outlive her children, and Elizabeth outlived 2 of hers, and outlived them in the worst way imaginable, and bore it in silence to her own quiet end. If there is a quality in her that deserves our particular admiration, it is the quiet endurance with which she seems to have met a fate that would have broken many. She bore in the course of her life very nearly the whole range of what fortune can inflict and bestow, the heights of glory and the depths of grief, and she bore it, as far as we can tell, with a steady and silent strength. She did not, like some, leave behind a record of complaint or lamentation, did not make of her suffering a public spectacle, did not, so far as we know, break under the weight of what she carried. She simply endured, lived through it, went on, and carried her sorrows to her grave in the same silence in which she had carried so much of her life. There is a kind of dignity in this that the noisy and self-dramatizing rarely achieve, the dignity of a soul that meets its fate without flinching and without display, that suffers what must be suffered and asks for no applause. We cannot know whether this reticence was the mark of strength or merely the lot of a woman whose words were never recorded, but the shape of her life suggests a real and quiet fortitude, the Howard steel bent to the bearing of grief, and it is a quality worth honouring in a world that so often mistakes noise for strength. There is a temptation, in telling a story like hers, to draw a neat moral from it, to make of her a lesson about the dangers of ambition or the cruelty of power or the vanity of worldly glory. And there is truth in all of those. Her family story is indeed a parable of ambition, of a house that reached too high and was destroyed by the very forces that had raised it, that built its fortunes on the shifting sand of a king's desire and was swept away when the desire turned. But I am wary of reducing Elizabeth herself to a moral, because she was not the author of her family's ambition, not the architect of its rise or the cause of its fall. She was, as far as we can tell, a woman who lived within the structures of her age, who did what was expected of her, who bore her children and ran her households, and served her queen, and watched, with whatever mixture of pride and fear, no one can now say, as the men of her family played the dangerous game that would destroy them. She was more acted upon than acting, more a sufferer than a striver, and her tragedy was not the tragedy of overreaching, but the tragedy of being bound to those who overreached, of loving children who were caught in forces beyond her control or theirs. Consider the strange asymmetry of memory that has shaped how we know this family. Anne Boleyn is among the most famous women in all of history, her face and her fate known across the world, written about endlessly, dramatized again and again, a figure of perennial fascination. Her daughter, Elizabeth I, is more famous still, one of the most celebrated monarchs who ever lived. The men of the family, Thomas and George, have their place in the histories, studied and discussed. And the woman who stood at the centre of them all, who bore the famous queen and the famous son, who was the mother of one queen and the grandmother of another, has been allowed to vanish almost without trace, unstudied, unremembered, barely a name. It is as though a great tree should be known in every leaf and branch, while the root that fed it all lay forgotten in the dark earth, unregarded and unknown. The mother is the root of the whole family's story, the source from which the famous siblings sprang, and yet she is the one part of it that history has left in shadow. There is no justice in this asymmetry, only the old habit of forgetting women, and it is worth for once reversing the usual order and giving the mother the attention that has been lavished so freely on her children. And so the truest thing to say of her, I think, is simply that she deserves to be remembered, and remembered with compassion. She has been forgotten, swallowed up in the fame of her offspring and the noise of her age, reduced to a shadow behind the famous faces, defamed by her family's enemies, lost to history. And the forgetting is an injustice, because her life, rightly seen, is one of the most quietly affecting of all the lives that the Tudor age has left us. It is the life of a woman who knew the greatest glory and the deepest grief, who rose to the summit and fell to the depths, who gave the world a queen and lost a queen who was her own child, and who bore it all, the whole vast burden of her extraordinary fate, in a silence that has covered her ever since. To call her back from that silence, to speak her name and tell her story and feel the weight of what she endured, is to do her a small and overdue justice. For she was not nobody. She was Elizabeth Howard, born to the highest blood in England, mother of Mary and Anne and George Boleyn, mother of a queen, grandmother of the greatest queen the nation would ever know. She stood at the centre of the most consequential drama of her age, and she paid for her place in it with a grief almost beyond bearing. And though history has forgotten her, though her grave is uncertain and her face is lost and her voice is silent, she lived, and she suffered, and she endured, and her blood runs on through the centuries to this very day. She deserves to be more than a footnote to her children's fame. She deserves to be remembered as a person, a mother, a woman who lived through more than most of us could bear, and who has waited, in the silence, for someone to look properly. Tonight, for a few hours, we have looked, and I hope, wherever she lies among the Howards at Lambeth, that the looking has done her some small honour. At last, if the few hours we have spent together in her vanished world have brought you some measure of calm, then I am glad of it. And if you would like more of these quiet evenings to come and find you, you are always welcome to follow along. But that is a small thing, and it can wait for the morning. For now, wherever you are and whatever the hour, let the story settle, and let the great drama of those long-dead lives fade gently into the dark, and let yourself grow still. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.